The rain came down, like it had a personal grudge against this valley. On the gravel forecourt of a honey-colored stone manor standing alone beneath a bruised gray sky, a gray mare screamed, not the sound of fear, but the sound of a creature being torn apart from the inside. 6 men wrestled with ropes. Pink blood ran into the mud. One of them swung a rope at the flank of an animal already so terrified her eyes had rolled white. On the stone steps above it all, a man in black stood terribly still, the cold stillness of a storm that hadn't yet decided where to strike. Shoot her, 2 words. Flat as a closing door. The keeper already had the fowling piece against his shoulder, cheek pressed to the stock. Then, out of the gray curtain of rain, a soaked figure came running across the gravel. A small hand pressed the barrel down into the mud. No, nobody knew who she was, nobody knew what she was running from. And nobody, not even she herself, suspected that at the bottom of that drenched trunk behind her, a secret lay waiting. A secret heavy enough to drown the entire house, quietly holding its breath around her. The bridge was gone. Not damaged. Gone. A dark gap where wet planks used to be, and Eleanor Ashworth stood on the wrong side of it with her trunk on a farmer's cart behind her and rain coming down like something with a grudge against her specifically. She paid the farmer, watched him turn his horse, watched until the cart was nothing but a smear of gray on a grayer road, and then she picked up her bag, because there was no other way to Renfield Hall now, and because 3 days of coaches that smelled of wet wool and older regret had brought her too far to turn back. So she walked the last mile. The rain had opinions about her. It seemed personally offended she hadn't brought a better coat. She did not complain. She had given up complaining somewhere around her 16th year, because complaining never once fixed anything. It only made the weather feel important, and Eleanor refused to give weather that satisfaction. Her boots filled first, then her hem. Then, past a stand of black elms that dripped on her like they were trying to help and only making it worse, something else filled too. A sound. High. Wrong. The kind that doesn't stay in your ears, it goes straight through, down into the chest and sits there like a stone you swallowed by mistake, screaming. Eleanor stopped, for 1 second. Long enough to think, that isn't fear, that's agony, and long enough to realize her feet had already decided what happened next. Because they were moving before her mind had finished the sentence, she ran. The drive opened onto a gravel forecourt, and the forecourt was chaos, men everywhere. 6 of them, 8. She didn't stop to count, all shouting over one another. All of them equally useless. In the middle of it, a gray mare reared against a net of ropes, eyes rolled white, forelegs slicing the wet air like she meant to cut her own way out of the world. A groom had 1 rope and was being dragged through the mud like a sack of grain. Another man swung a second rope at her flank, which was, Eleanor thought, the single stupidest thing she had ever watched a grown man do to a terrified animal, and she had grown up around terrified animals. The mare came down hard, spun, struck her shoulder against the mounting block. Blood ran pink down her leg into the mud, and on the steps above it, all stood a man in black, tall. Still, terribly still, not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of violence that hasn't yet decided where to land. He wasn't shouting, he didn't need to be. Shoot her. 4 words, flat as a closed door. A keeper by the stable arch already had the fowling piece to his shoulder, before the man finished the sentence. Cheek pressed to the stock, and Eleanor understood with total icy clarity that she had perhaps 4 seconds before this became something that could never ever be undone. No, the word left her before she decided to say which was, she would think later, the entire story of her life folded into a single syllable. Her bonnet fell, she never felt it leave her hand. She was already crossing the gravel, already pressing her palm flat against the keeper's barrel and forcing it down toward the mud. And the man was so astonished by a soaked stranger materializing out of the rain that he simply stupidly let her. Give her room. Her voice cut through the noise like it had been sharpened for the purpose. All of you back. Drop the ropes. Miss Groom started. Drop them. Something in how she said it did what her size never could. 6 large men took 1 step back, then another. The ropes went slack in the mud. And Eleanor Ashworth, 22 years old, drenched to the skin, a total stranger to every soul on that gravel, walked toward a horse that had already opened one man's scalp that same morning. She didn't look at the mare's eyes, never the eyes. Her father had taught her that before he'd taught her to read. Make yourself small. Make yourself boring. Give the animal nothing to fear. Because fear needs a target and you simply refuse to be one. She stopped 6 feet off, turned her body sideways, looked out at the rain instead, as though it were the single most interesting rain she'd ever encountered in her life. There, now, not to the horse, to the air, like she was speaking to no one at all, and the mare could choose to listen or not, entirely her decision to make. What a great deal of fuss. The ears came forward half an inch. Everything. Eleanor reached into her wet pocket and drew out a plain snaffle bit, her father's. The one thing of his she'd refused to sell even when selling everything else had kept them fed one more month. Worn smooth by 40 years of decent hand, she held it low, let the rain run off the cold metal, waited. 1 minute, 2. The men behind her had gone silent, which felt, honestly, like its own small miracle. The man on the steps hadn't moved at all. The mare took a step, then another, lowered her ruined, trembling head and lipped at the bit sitting flat in Eleanor's open palm like it was the only sane object left anywhere in the world. Eleanor slid her other hand along the wet jaw, slow as sunrise. Stood there stroking the great shaking neck, feeling the animal's breath come down out of terror and settle into something closer to plain exhaustion. There, she murmured. There, you are not going to die today. Nobody with sense shoots a horse worth 200 guineas. Because she was frightened of a rope, she looked up. And the man on the steps was looking directly at her. He was younger than the black coat had made him seem, 30 perhaps. Hair the color of wet ash. Eyes so deep a blue they read almost black across the distance of the face in a shut one. He studied her the way a man Billy wasn't expecting and cannot currently afford. Take her in, he said to the grooms without moving his eyes off Eleanor. Dry her poultice the shoulder. A pause and something in it cost him. Don't shoot anything today. The men led the mare away. Gentle now because she was gentle now, and Eleanor stood alone in the rain with her father's bit warm in her fist and mud to her knees. You are the woman my grandmother sent for. Not a question, I am, your grace. Eleanor Ashworth dropped a curtsy, which was frankly absurd given the state of her hem, and did it anyway because manners didn't stop mattering simply on account of a person being soaked through. The Dowager Duchess engaged me as her companion. You are late, the bridge is down, sir. I walked the last of it. Looked at her. Her ruined skirts, her bonnet drowning somewhere in the gravel behind her, the mare's blood drying pink along her wrist. And whatever he saw there, she would spend weeks trying to work out exactly what it did not soften a single line of his face. Whitfield will show you your room, he turned. Went into the house, his boots ringing hard against the stone, and did not once look back, though Eleanor thought, standing there dripping in the ruined gravel, that some small part of him might have wanted to. Eleanor picked up her bonnet and did not watch him go, though every nerve in her body wanted badly to. She hadn't noticed the butler until he was already coming down the steps toward her. A spare, upright man past 60, gray as a winter hedge, who had watched the whole business from the shelter of the doorway with an expression she could not read at all. Miss Ashworth. He said it like he was tasting the name for the first time. Whitfield. If you'll come this way. He reached for her trunk before she could protest. You needn't, I'll carry it, miss. And something almost like warmth moved behind his eyes. In 40 years of service, I have never once seen that mare come to a stranger's hand. Not one time. He said nothing else. He didn't need to, and Eleanor understood, even in that first exhausted hour, that this was a man who chose his words ways that she chose her figures sparingly, and only when they were certain to be exactly right. Behind them in the yard, a wiry man in a leather waistcoat stood watching the whole scene from beside the stable arch with his arms folded and his jaw hanging slightly open. He was Jethro, the head groom, 50 years old and taciturn as stone, and he would tell this story to his grandchildren someday, embellishing it very little, because it required no embellishing at all. He didn't say a word to her that first evening. He only watched her go, and touched 2 fingers briefly to his cap, the way a man salutes something he doesn't yet have the words for. Eleanor Ashworth had come to Renfield Hall to disappear. That was the whole of the plan, really stripped down to its bones. Disappear. Become small. Become the sort of person a room forgets is standing in it. She had spent 9 months building the skill letters signed simply E. Ashworth, a false direction. Careful vagueness about her people, her past, her prospects. She had told the Dowager Duchess she was a gentleman's orphan without fortune, obliged. All of it was true. Which was the trick of it. Because what she hadn't said, what she had folded up small and tucked away where no one would think to look, was the rest. That there was in fact a fortune. That it was hers. That it currently sat in a strong box belonging to a cousin of her late father's, a man she would have crossed 3 counties on foot to avoid, and very nearly had. Her father had died when she was 19. He'd left her £4,000 and one piece of foolishness dressed up as kindness, the money held in trust until she married, or turned 25, whichever came first. The trustee he'd named, meaning to protect her, meaning to give her a guardian in a world that thought little of unmarried women managing their own affairs, was his nephew Edmund Thorpe. Mr. Thorpe had a son, Mr. Thorpe had a plan. If Eleanor married the son Roderick, of the damp handshake and the wetter conversation, the £4,000 would stay exactly where Mr. Thorpe found it most convenient, which was, as it happened, already partway spent. She'd refused Roderick in October, in a drawing room that smelled of boiled mutton and desperation, and she still, on quiet nights, could summon every detail of that particular afternoon whether she wished to or not. Roderick had proposed with a speech clearly rehearsed in front of a mirror, one hand pressed flat to his waistcoat, eyes fixed somewhere over her left shoulder rather than on her face, as though the whole business embarrassed him nearly as much as it did her. He had spoken of duty, of family, of the excellent match their two households would make, by which he plainly meant the excellent match her £4,000 would make with his father's considerable debts. He had not once, in the whole of mentioned anything resembling affection. "You needn't decide this instant," his father had said, beaming from the doorway, as though the matter were already a foregone conclusion requiring only the formality of her agreement. "Take the evening, sleep on it. I'm certain, once you've had a proper think, you'll see the sense of it." She had not needed the evening. She had needed, as it turned out, considerably less than a full minute, and the look on Edmund Thorpe's face when she said so, plainly without apology, was one she carried with her every mile of the road north, not because it frightened her, though it had, but because it confirmed something she had suspected for months and badly needed confirmed, that this was never at any point about her happiness. It had only ever been about her money and how conveniently it might be kept from ever truly belonging to her. She left the house in November with 15 shillings, one trunk, and her father's snaffle bit, because staying meant becoming somebody's answer to a debt she had never agreed to hold. She'd answered an advertisement under a name, close enough to true that she wouldn't forget to answer to it, but distant enough that a lawyer's clerk in some coaching inn wouldn't connect the dots. Signed her letters plainly. Prayed the whole way north that the name meant nothing at all to anyone in this particular green corner of the country. 25 was 3 years off. She had only to remain hidden, unmarried, small, and the money became hers entirely, and no man on God's earth. At 3 years. She'd sit invisible most of her life already. How difficult could 3 more be? She had not counted on Renfield Hall. The house was dying. That was the pity of it, because it was Eleanor could see this even soaked and shivering in the front hall, dripping onto flagstones that hadn't been properly scrubbed in far longer than they should have gone. A genuinely beautiful house. Long, low, honey-colored stone that seemed to have grown straight up out of its valley, rather than been set down arrogantly on top of it. 200 years of good sense in its bones. And it was going to the bad the way a strong man goes to the bad. From the inside. With nobody willing to say the word out loud, she saw it first in small thing. Whitfield's coat, immaculately brushed, with a collar gone soft at the edge from being turned twice already. The particular way the hall smelled, not of neglect exactly, but of something worse. Of holding one's breath. This way, Smish. She followed him up a staircase with a carpet worn pale down the center, past a corridor of shuts, 6 of them. 7 sheeted furniture just visible through the gaps where the doors didn't quite close. Ghost shapes under white cloth, like the whole wing had been asked to hold very still, and had been holding it a long time. "Are these rooms not in use?" Whitfield didn't slow his pace. "The east wing has been closed some while, miss." "Since when?" A pause. "Small. But there. Since the spring before last." She didn't press. Something in the set of his shoulders told her the question would cost him to answer, and she had only just arrived. And a person doesn't spend another person's grief for information on her very first afternoon. But she filed it. She filed everything. Another one of her besetting sins, if she was honest. Her room was small and clean and cold, and she was grateful for all 3, because small meant private, clean meant somebody still cared enough to try, and cold she could fix herself with the still sissing hopefully empty beside the grate. She changed out of her wet things, wrung her hem over the basin, sat exactly 4 minutes with her hands pressed flat against her knees, breathing, because that was what she did. 4 minutes. It's never 5, never 3. A private arithmetic that let her feel she'd allowed herself the indulgence of falling apart without actually technically doing it. Then she got up. Because sitting didn't fix roofs. Sitting didn't fix accounts, and it certainly didn't fix whatever had put that terrible stillness into a young duke's face. She went down to find the kitchen. Not because anyone asked her to. Because the kitchen tells you everything a front hall is too polite to say. She was right. The kitchen was warm at least, which the rest of the house appeared to consider optional. A broad woman with red hands and redder eyes stood over a joint of beef that had gone. Eleanor could see this from the doorway distinctly, unmistakably green at the fat. "Oh, don't mind me, miss. I'll have it sorted. The woman didn't look up, wiping her eyes with the back of one wrist. Only it's the 2nd this month, and Mr. Grimshaw settled with the butcher, and Mr. Grimshaw won't be told his business by a cook. And who? Eleanor asked. Is Mr. Grims? The agent, Miss the steward. Come after the old Duke died, and Mrs. Pettifer that was housekeeper, God rest her, died the winter after. There's been no housekeeper since, only him. He's got the running of everything and the keys of everything. Eleanor looked at the green beef. At the 2 exhausted maids scrubbing pots in water gone cold an hour past. At the smoke curling sullenly back into the room instead of up the flue, because she'd have wagered her whole £4,000 on it nobody had swept that chimney since the spring before last either. There's truly no housekeeper at all? In a house this size, miss, the woman said, as though it explained everything, as though it were the whole answer and the whole question besides. There's Mr. Grimshaw. Eleanor said nothing. She was a companion, not a housekeeper. Her entire employment was to sit 4 hours a day with an old woman, read to her, agree with her opinions, and otherwise furniture with a pulse. That was the job, the whole small, safe job. But she had been raised to run a house, a small one, a house of no particular account but hers to run from the age of 14. After her mother died and her father's grief filled every room like water finding its own level, she knew what a linen press ought to smell like. She knew beef didn't come in green. And she knew, with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach beside the certainty about the fortune, and the certainty about Roderick Thorpe's damp handshake, that a house where one man held every key and answered to no one was a house being quietly, patiently robbed. Mrs. Hargrove, once the worst of the crying had passed, turned out to be a talker, the kind of woman who had clearly been saving up 2 years of unspoken grievance and simply required a single kind question to let the whole of it come pouring out. It wasn't always like this, miss, not before. She scraped the ruined joint into a bucket meant for the pigs, her mouth tight with something between anger and old Sasso. When Miss Rosalind kept the house, this kitchen ran like a ship's galley. Everything weighed, everything counted, and not a farthing wasted. Mind, but never once did meat come in green, nor a maid go without her proper wages on quarter day. She shook her head slowly. She'd come down herself. Some mornings, sleeves rolled to the elbow, taste the stock before it went into the pot. A duke's sister and once too proud to taste her own kitchen stock. What happened? After. Miss Hertzgrove's face did some complicated. After, his grace couldn't bear to come near the kitchen at all, on account of it being hers, same as everything else in this house that was hers. And Mr. Grimshaw, God forgive me for saying it plain, saw his chance and took it, settled the accounts himself. Told the tradesmen he'd deal with them direct. No need to trouble the family with such small matters. And who was to say otherwise with no housekeeper and no mistress, and a master too deep in his own grief to notice a green joint of beef if it walked up and introduced itself? She set the bucket down hard enough to rattle the flagstones. I've said my piece to him twice, miss, and been told both times to mind my own kitchen and leave the household accounts to a man who understands them. As though boiling beef and knowing when it's gone off aren't the very same kind of understanding. She looked at Eleanor, something almost pleading in her red-rimmed eyes. You'll forgive an old cook talking out of turn. Only it does a body good, some days, simply to say the thing out loud to somebody who looks like she's actually listening, rather than merely waiting for her turn to speak. I am listening, Mrs. Hargrove, Eleanor said. I intend to keep listening, if you'll let me. She said none of it further that first evening. She folded her hands and made herself no promises she could not yet keep. Learned the maids' names Nell and the younger one Peg. Asked the cook, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Hargrove, what she needed, and got in return a look of such pure, startled gratitude that it was plain nobody had asked her that particular question in a very long while. And she held her tongue. She was very good at holding her tongue. She'd had years of practice. Her dinner, taken alone in a small room off the kitchen passage, because companions ate neither with the family nor properly with the staff, occupying instead some unmapped territory in between, was simple and hot, and she was grateful for it. She thought about the mare. About the way the man in black had said shoot her without raising his voice at all, and how that had frightened her considerably more than the shouting had, because shouting men could sometimes be reasoned with, if you caught them at the right moment. Stillness like that had already finished reasoning. It had already decided, and yet he'd stopped it. When she asked, when she simply acted, hadn't even properly asked, he'd let her. Told the grooms not to shoot anything today, as though the sentence cost him something to say, and he'd said it regardless. There is a good man in there, she thought, and then caught the thought and turned it over with real suspicion. The way you'd check a coin for the wrong weight, because that kind of thinking, that soft, hopeful, dangerous kind of thinking, was precisely the kind that got a woman noticed. And noticed was the one thing she absolutely could not afford to be. Not for 3 years. She finished her plate, went up to bed, lay listening to rain that had finally, grudgingly, begun to ease, and told herself firmly that whatever was wrong with this house, and whatever was wrong with its owner was not, under any circumstance, her business. She very nearly believed it. Morning came gray and mild, and with it, Whitfield at her door at 8:30, to say the Dowager Duchess would see her in the small south parlor directly after breakfast, and would Miss Ashworth please not be late. Her Grace did not care for late. Eleanor was not late. The south parlor was, she understood within 30 seconds of entering it, the single genuinely warm room in the entire house. A good fire, good chairs. And in the best of the chairs, wrapped in a shawl the color of a pigeon's breast, sat a very old woman with a spine like a poker and eyes that had evidently given up missing anything at all sometime around the reign of the 3rd George. She looked Eleanor up and down, slowly, for a full, uncomfortable half-minute. "I'm sorry to disappoint, Your Grace." "I didn't say I was disappointed." The old voice cracked like a dry branch. "I said you weren't what I expected. There is a considerable difference, girl, and if you mean to get on in this world, you'd best learn to hear it." A knotted hand tapped the arm of the chair. "Sit not there, here, where I can see your face." Eleanor sat, and found, once seated, that the old woman's gaze had a peculiar weight to it, not unkind, but thorough the way a jeweler examines a stone before deciding what it's truly worth setting. "You'll forgive an old woman her bluntness," Petronella said, before Eleanor had said a single further word. "I have buried a husband, 2 sons, and a granddaughter, and I find at my age that politeness has become a luxury I can no longer afford to spend on pleasantries that don't matter. So I shall ask you plainly, and I shall expect a plain answer in return. Why does a gentleman's daughter, however plain her circumstances, walk into a house of strangers with nothing but a trunk and a look about her eyes that says she is running from something rather more particular than mere poverty?" Eleanor's breath caught, just slightly. "I could not say, ma'am." "You could. You simply won't." Which is its own kind of answer, and I shall accept it, for now, because I find I rather like a person who knows the value of holding something back until the proper moment arrives to spend it. The old eyes glinted sharp as a hawk's. "But mark me, girl, I have lived long enough to know the difference between a woman hiding from cruelty, and a woman hiding a cruelty of her own making. I do not believe, looking at you, that you are the second kind. I should be very disappointed indeed to discover I was wrong." "You will not be disappointed, Your Grace," Eleanor said, and meant it entirely, though she could not yet have said precisely what she was promising. "My grandson tells me you gentled the grey mare in the rain within your first hour on my land." "The mare was only frightened, ma'am." "The mare," said the Dowager, "has put 2 grooms to bed since Michaelmas and was to be shot on Tuesday. Do not tell me she was only frightened, as though you'd picked up a dropped glove." The pale, unclouded eyes studied her. "That mare belonged to my granddaughter, to Rosalind, my grandson's sister." Something shifted in the room. A pressure change like weather. "She's dead." Eleanor went very still. "I'm very sorry, ma'am." "Everyone is very sorry." The old woman turned her face towards the fire, and for one moment the sharpness left her, and something older thing worse sat down in its place. It is the least useful sentence in the language. Silence. "She was 23, Augusta said finally, to the flame, not to Eleanor. "A fever, esprit. She was mistress of this house. There has never been a duchess, you understand. My grandson never married, so Rosalind kept the keys, kept the peace, kept the whole place breathing." A pause a beat too long. "And then 1 week in April she was too warm at dinner. The week after she was in the ground." Eleanor did not say she was sorry a second time. "My the Dowager went on, in a flatter voice now, "was in London when it happened. Business that could not wait. He returned 3 days after we buried her." Her ruined hands folded themselves precisely in her lap. "He has not set foot in the East Wing since, nor spoken her name if he can help it, nor looked at a single thing in this house that wants doing, because everything that wants doing was hers. I think I understand it, ma'am. I think you do too." The old eyes came back to her sharp again. "Which is why you are the first companion in a 12-month I have not's home inside the week." She straightened. "Now, you've been in this house one night. Tell me what you've seen, and don't be tactful." "I have no patience left for tactful," so Eleanor told her she hadn't meant to. But there is a particular dangerous relief in being asked a true question, by someone who genuinely wants the true answer. And she'd been holding all of it in since the green beef, since the sheeted furniture, since Mrs. Hargrove's red eyes. She told her about the meat. the smoking flue, the shut rooms and the smell of damp that meant a roof somewhere had gone unrepaired far too long. She told her carefully, choosing each word like a foot set on ice, about Mr. Grimshaw, who settled every account and held every key and could not, apparently, be told his business by anyone at all. The dowager listened without moving. When Eleanor finished, the old woman was quiet a long moment. "My grandson," she said at last, "is not a fool. He is a grieving man, which is an entirely different thing. Though from the outside they wear the same coat rather well, he has let one man hold the reins because he cannot bear to pick them up himself." She turned her head slowly. "You know something of accounts, a little, ma'am. Don't be modest." "I loathe modesty above all the false virtues." Eleanor almost smiled, caught herself, did not. "I am going to make you useful," the dowager said. And there was something in the tone that made it sound less like an offer and more like a verdict already delivered. "Not as a companion. Companions are furniture, and I have no more use for furniture than you have for false modesty. I'm giving you the running of the kitchen accounts on my authority, which in this house is a good deal older than Mr. Grimshaw's. Your Grace, he told my grandson you wouldn't last a month." The old woman's face did something almost like pleasure. "Small dry there, and gone, did he?" "Not a question." "Then you have 29 days to prove him wrong, and I'd suggest you use them wisely." She used them, not by arguing. Eleanor had never once won anything by arguing, and she wasn't about to begin now, in a house where she owned nothing, held no tie, and had every reason to avoid anyone looking at her too closely. She won the only way she trusted. By quietly, without fuss, indispensable. She started with the still room, is a house's honesty in miniature. 3 years of spoiled preserves came out in buckets. Mouse-fouled flour. At the very back, half hidden, a set of shelves that had plainly belonged to someone else, once neat labels in a round, careful hand, cordials and rosewater, all gone to ruin now, untouched since April. Eleanor understood whose hand that was before anyone told her. She cleaned every jar, kept every label. It felt obscurely like a small wrong to throw away the handwriting of the dead, so she didn't. She moved to the linen next. Had the maid strike every press, wash and turn and mend the whole of it, and where sheets had rotted past saving, she cut them down for bandages and dusters, because nothing in this house, she was fast deciding, would be wasted on her watch. Not thing more. She had the flue swept. 8 in total, for the privilege of a kitchen that no longer smoked at breakfast, and she could not for the life of her understand why that had taken 3 years and one stranger's interference to accomplish. She sent the green beef back to the butcher with a note in her own hand. Courteous, immovable. The next joint arrived red all the way through, and she began quietly to keep the kitchen per self, a small thing, a cook's ledger, what came in at the door, what was paid for it, week on week. The dowager had given her that much authority and not 1 inch more. But a house is a single body. And if you have your finger on even one vein, you can feel the whole heart beating underneath it. The wager, when she finally heard about it, made her laugh out loud, once alone in her room, door shut, because it was exactly the sort of thing a house like this one would do. Bet on how quickly the new girl would break. A shilling on Lady Day. That was the going rate on her survival. Even Nell, who'd been kind, who brought her water without being asked and had a shy gap-toothed smile Eleanor had already grown fond of, had quietly put 6pence on the month. Eleanor didn't blame anyone. She'd have taken the bet herself once. Had, in a manner of speaking, when she signed a false direction and walked north with 15 shillings and a snaffle bit, and no earthly guarantee any of it would come to anything at all. So she went on. Quietly, she did not scold. She did not command. She never once reminded a soul that the Dowager Duchess had put a shred of authority in her hands, because reminding people of authority was, in her experience, the surest way to make them resent you for having it. She simply took hold of the things nobody else would touch, one after another, and did them well, and let the doing be the entire argument. Within a fortnight, her figures stopped agreeing with the houses. It started small. A discrepancy of shillings here, something. Shillings there, nothing that would ring an alarm on its own. Nothing a tired steward with too much on his plate couldn't wave off as honest error. But Eleanor had kept her father's accounts her whole life, and she'd learned doing it, a single thing she never afterward forgot. A ledger is the one honest room in the world. A column adds or it doesn't. No amount of shouting makes a false sum true. She loved the accounts for exactly that reason. They didn't care that she was small, or plain, or a woman with no name worth mentioning. They only cared whether she was right. She went to the butcher's own tally stick in the cold passage behind the kitchen, standing in her damp shawl while he read on the numbers off in his flat country voice. "Shillings a week," he told her. "Same as always, miss. Ask anyone." She thanked him. Wrote it down. Then she went and stood before the sheet posted on the servants' board, the quarterly reckoning Mr. Grimshaw put up, for form's sake, once every 3 months. The butcher's line read 14 shillings. Eleanor stood in that cold passage a long time. Looking, not touching the sheet, just looking, while something cold and certain settled into her stomach and stayed there. 5 shillings a week, on one tradesman. 1 line out of dozens. She didn't say anything. She was very good at not saying anything. She wrote it into her own small book instead, the one she'd begun keeping under the false bottom of her workbox, beneath the thimbles and the darning wool, where no maid would think to look and no steward would think to search. And she thought, not for the first time, and very much not the last, that a house this beautiful had no business being robbed blind by a man who smiled while he did it. She met Mr. Grimshaw properly 3 days later, and understood within the first 30 seconds of conversation that everything Mrs. Hargrove's red eyes had told her was true. And worse, he was soft pink, pleasant-faced. A man of perhaps 40 who smiled a great deal, and Eleanor had learned young from her father, from Roderick Thorpe's damp, eager handshake, that men who smiled that much and that easily were usually smiling at something they didn't want you to see behind it. She was in the storeroom, counting linen, slate in, when he came in from the passage, soft-footed for a heavy man. Miss Ashworth, a smile, warm as spoiled milk. In my storeroom, in her Grace's storeroom, Mr. Grimshaw, she gets up from the slate. Her Grace has asked me to take inventory. You keep a great many accounts for a companion. Her Grace keeps me busy. Her Grace, he said, still smiling, taking one soft step closer, is 1 in 80. She will not always be here to keep you busy. Another step. His voice dropped, friendly, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. A word of counsel, Miss Ashworth. From one servant to another. This is a large house with a great deal of dark in it. A young woman with no friends. No family, for you have none, have you? Does well to keep to the linen. To ask no questions whose answers can't help her. Eleanor set down her slate, looked at him, level gray, unafraid, or at least unwilling to show him anything else. And underneath the smile for half a second, gone as soon as it arrived, she saw it. He was frightened of her, that was the whole of it. He'd come in smiling to frighten her off, and it was his own fear that had actually driven him here. Because a clever woman with a slate and a habit of asking after tallies had been standing far too near his open door. I keep excellent accounts, Mr. Grimshaw, sweet. It is the one thing I do that no one has ever asked me to stop. Good evening. She walked past him, out, slate under her arm. Her hands didn't shake until she reached the stairs. She thought about telling the Duke. Thought about it 3 days and 3 nights, turning it over the way you'd turn over a coin you weren't sure was counterfeit, hunting for the flaw. She didn't go. Her reasons were good ones, she told herself, over and over, until it very nearly sounded true. To go to him now was to be seen, properly seen, questioned about her history, her people, her name, and behind her name stood Edmund Thorpe and £4,000, and a marriage she'd crossed half a country to escape. A companion who made an enemy of the steward and lost would be turned off with a bad character. A companion turned off with a bad character could be traced. Traced meant found. Found meant Roderick's damp hand again and the whole slow suffocation starting over. Better to hold her tongue. Better to keep her head down and let a rich man's house rob itself blind, because it wasn't her house and it wasn't her fight, and she had absolutely no business, except she kept thinking about the labels in the still room. About handwriting that would never write anything again. Except she kept thinking of Mrs. Hargrove's red eyes over beef gone green, which a competent steward would never have let past the kitchen door in the first place. Except every night, in her narrow cold room, she added another figure to the book beneath the thimbles, and told herself this was the last one. She'd truly stop now, and didn't. She saw him again on the 3rd evening, the Duke, not Grimshaw, in the long gallery, entirely by accident, which turned out to be the only way anyone ever met him at all. She had a basket of mended linen on her hip, and a smudge of beeswax on her wrist, and she stood aside for him at the wall, eyes down the way a servant ought. He went past her, then stopped. You're the woman with the mare? Yes, your Grace, my grandmother has set you to the linen. Among other things, sir. He looked at her properly then, for the first time since the forecourt, now that she was dry and it was daylight rather than driving rain. Small, quiet, brown-haired. No particular beauty, the sort of face a crowded ballroom would look straight through without noticing it was ever there. Except when she raised her eyes to answer him, they were level, gray clear, entirely, unnervingly without fear. He hadn't been looked at like that by anyone in a year. His servants studied the floor when he passed. His grandmother looked straight through him to whatever she was actually thinking about. This woman looked at him as though he were simply a man who had asked a question, And she had the answer, and she was quietly deciding how much of it he could bear to hear. It unsettled him. He wasn't used to being seen. "The mare is sound," he said abruptly, as though the words had escaped before he'd properly authorized them. "The shoulder's healed. I'm glad, sir. You were right. She was worth more than a fright." He seemed to want to say something else, seemed to have no idea how. His jaw worked once, twice around a sentence that never arrived. "That's all," he said finally, and went on down the gallery, and did not understand, could not have explained even to himself why his own house felt, for one strange unguarded moment, less like a tomb than it had in a very long while. Eleanor stood with the basket on her hip and watched him go. "There is a good man in there," she thought. Again, she fought the thought less hard than before. "Drowning," she added. "But there." And then, because she was who she was, she thought about the butcher's 5 shillings a week, about the roof over the east wing, about 4,000 £4,000 sitting in Edmund Thorpe's strong box, waiting on a marriage she would rather starve than agree to. She told herself firmly that none of it was her affair. She was here to be invisible. For 3 years she was not here to save a duke, or his house, or anyone. She very nearly believed it. It was 2 nights later that she saw him for the second time that week, and this time he did not see her at all. She'd gone out past midnight for water for the linen, a small errand, an unremarkable one, and something took her past the kitchen garden gate instead of straight back in, out toward the low stone wall that marked the edge of the family churchyard. She never afterward could say exactly what pulled her there. Some instinct she chose not to examine too closely. She saw him before she understood what she was seeing, a shape in the dark, standing very still among the headstones, the way he'd stood on the steps that first afternoon, except there was nothing controlled about this stillness at all. A different kind of still. The kind that comes from holding something so tightly, you're afraid of what happens the instant you let even an inch of it go. She should have turned back, she didn't. She watched him take something from inside his coat. Small metal. It caught what little moonlight there was and threw it back in a thin, cold line, and it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, a medal. Naval by the ribbon and the shape of it, though she knew little enough of such things to be certain. He turned it over once in his hand, closed his fist around it, bowed his head, and said something so quiet the wind nearly took it before it reached her. She caught only pieces. "Should have been here." A long silence. "I'm sorry." "I am so sorry." His voice broke on the word, actually broke, a sound she would not have believed that controlled, closed stillness capable of making, and he stopped. Stood there. Fist closed around whatever he was holding, head bowed to a headstone she couldn't read from where she stood but didn't need to. She backed away, slow, careful. Not a single pebble turned beneath her boot, 'cause some instincts she'll quite lose no matter how many years pass in, and she'd been raised in a house where a girl learned early to move without being heard. She circled the long way round, in through the scullery door, up the back stairs into her cold narrow room, and sat on the edge of her bed with her hands pressed flat against her knees. 4 minutes. She let herself have 5. Because the man she had built in her mind, the cold one, the closed one, the man who could say shoot her without raising his voice, did not exist, had perhaps never existed at all. What existed instead was a man kneeling alone in the dark, apologizing to a grave for a thing he could not undo, carrying a grief so heavy he'd built an entire fortress of silence just to hold its weight. And somewhere behind that silence, patient as rotten a bee, a soft pink man with a smile like spoiled milk was quietly, methodically robbing him blind. Eleanor sat in the dark a long while. She was no longer thinking about 3 years, or invisibility, or the small careful life she'd promised herself in a coaching inn with 15 shillings and a snaffle bit. She was thinking that somebody, sooner or later, was going to have to tell this house the truth, and she was beginning, against every instinct that had kept her alive and unmarried and unfound for the better part of a year, to suspect that somebody might have to be her. She saw the mare again the next morning, properly, in daylight, in the paddock behind the stable block, and Jethro was there ahead of her, leaning on the fence rail with the particular patience of a man who had spent 50 years watching animals heal at their own speed, and had never once found a reason to hurry the process. "She'll do," he said, without turning his head, as though continuing a conversation they'd already been having for years rather than one they were only now beginning. "Shoulders sound. Temper's better than it's any right to be, given what was done to her." A pause. "You've a way with frightened things, miss. I'll not ask where you learned it." "My father kept horses. Before he kept nothing at all." Jethro nodded slowly, as though that answered a good deal more than the words themselves contained. "I thought as much. There's a way of standing still that a person only learns from an animal that could hurt them and chooses not to. You can't teach that from a book. Eleanor watched the mere crop grass at the far end of the paddock, unhurried, entirely at ease, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the forecourt. What's her name? Never had one proper. Miss Rosalind called her the Grey, mostly on account of there never seeming any need for more than that. Jethro's jaw worked once. His Grace hasn't called her anything at all, not once. Not in 2 years. Eleanor said nothing to that. She was learning an entire language in this house made up of things nobody said, and she was only beginning to learn to read it. I'll tell you this for nothing, miss, Jethro added, pushing off the fence rail at last. Whatever you're about in this house, and don't trouble yourself telling me you're not about anything, because I've buried 3 companions worth of that particular lie. Already you've done more good in a week than the last 3 years put together. Whatever it costs you, I'd reckon it's worth the paying. He touched 2 fingers to his cap and walked off toward the stable block, leaving Eleanor standing at the paddock rail with her chest considerably tighter than it had been a moment before, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with Grimshaw, or Ledges, or fear. The mornings after that night in the churchyard, Eleanor found she could not look at him the same way, which was a considerable problem because she had to look at him every evening in the library, over account books that weren't officially accounts yet, over tea Whitfield brought without being asked, because Whitfield noticed things, missed nothing, and had apparently decided some months back that his opinions mattered a good deal less than his loyalty. She had to sit across from a man who did not know she had watched him break in the dark and pretend she saw only the shut face, the careful stillness. The Duke who had told his own butler she wouldn't last a month, except she knew better now. And knowing better was its own particular danger. Because a woman who knows a man's screw starts, without meaning to, without deciding to, without any consent from her own better sense, to care about the shape of it, to wonder what it would cost to ease it, to catch herself thinking of him at odd hours over the linen count, over Mrs. Hargrove's accounts, over the slow columns of figures that were beginning, more and more, to tell a story Eleanor did not want to read but could not stop reading either. She told herself it changed nothing, it changed everything. She simply refused for a while yet to say so aloud. The evenings in the library became a habit before either of them called it one. It started with a book. The Dowager wanted a slim green volume of sermons she claimed to be reading, though Eleanor privately suspected she used it mainly as a weapon against dull afternoons, something to threaten unwelcome visitors with reading aloud from. Eleanor went to fetch it and found the Duke already there, sitting, not reading. A book closed on his knee, the fire burned low, and something in the particular quality of his silence told her this was not a man waiting to be interrupted so much as a man who had simply stopped expecting anyone to come at all. She made to withdraw. Stay. He didn't look up. Find her book. You don't disturb me. So she found the book. And she didn't leave immediately, because leaving immediately would have felt too much like fleeing, and she refused to give anyone in this house, even herself, the satisfaction of watching her run. She stood a moment by the shelves instead. They talked. Of nothing really. Of the weather which had turned mild and then changed its mind. Of a hunting print gone crooked on the wall that nobody had straightened in what was clearly years. And after that, without any arrangement at all, she came back the next evening, and he was there. And the evening after that, the library became, without either of them naming it, a country the 2 of them shared. Small. Warm. Its borders drawn by firelight, and the particular hour after supper when the rest of the house had gone quiet and Renfield Hall for 1 hour a night forgot to be a tomb. She was learning exactly what his grandmother had promised. Not cold, drowning. Beneath the shut face sat a man of dry, careful humor, the kind that surfaced sideways only when he thought no one was watching for it, and beneath that deeper still a great buried tenderness gone entirely to nettles, because nobody had found the courage yet to walk into that garden and start pulling weeds. He spoke of Rosalind exactly once in those early weeks. Laid the fire down to ember. He said it without looking at her, which Eleanor understood. Even was the only way he could say it at all. She sat in that chair, he said, where you're sitting now. She'd read out the foolish parts of the newspaper until I laughed. I didn't laugh often. She counted it a personal triumph every time. He turned the shut book over in his hands. Once. Twice I was in London when she took the fever. Matters that couldn't wait. A pause that stretched so long Eleanor thought he might never finish the sentence. I've never once managed to remember what any of them were. Eleanor did not say I'm sorry. She'd already learned from his grandmother that it was the least useful sentence in the language. She kept the whole house breathing. She said instead. Your grandmother told me. That's a great deal for one young woman to carry. She must have loved it a very great deal to carry it so well. The Duke looked at her across the embers. You carry it now, he said. Don't think I haven't noticed the table, the flue, the baskets you send out to the tenants. A pause. My grandmother's authority only reaches so far, Miss Ashworth. The rest of it is entirely you. She held very still. Why, it was the question she could not answer honestly. Not without answering all of it: the fortune, the flight, Thorpe Roderick. 3 years of careful invisibility she was, at that very moment, failing spectacularly at. So she gave him a true thing that was not the whole thing, because that was the only honesty currently available to her. Because a house oughtn't die of neglect while good people stand in it wringing their hands, she said. I cannot leave a thing half done, Your Grace. It is a fault of mine. If somebody let Miss... Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smus... The almost of one. I begin to believe you would, he said. She should have told him then. She thought that later, many times, turning the moment over the way you turn a stone looking for whatever's crawling underneath it. She should have told him in the firelight, with his guard down and his grief laid bare on the table between them, like something finally allowed to breathe. She didn't. Because telling him meant Grimshaw. And Grimshaw meant proof. And proof meant weeks more work she hadn't finished. And a rumor without proof was worse than no rumor at all. A rumor Grimshaw could smile away with his spoiled milk smile, wave off as the overactive imagination of a companion who'd taken too much interest in accounts that weren't her business. And there was her own reason too, the one she liked least of all. The one that sat in her chest beside her heart, and refused to be dislodged no matter how she reasoned with it. A woman who makes herself noticed makes herself found. So she said nothing, went back to her room, added another figure to the book beneath the thimbles. The storeroom door was unlocked on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and Eleanor would spend the rest of her life believing that single accident had reshaped the whole of what followed. Grimshaw had gone to the market town for the quarter sessions. The whole house knew it breathed easier for the day, the way a room breathes easier when a particular kind of weather has finally moved off somewhere else. Eleanor went to the storeroom at the end of the North Passage to finish her linen inventory, slate in, counting sheets in the voice that had become, over these past weeks, something close to a private ritual. 12, 13, 14. The numbers steadying her the way some women found steadiness in prayer. The storeroom shared a wall with the estate office and a door. The door stood open. She told herself she was only counting sheets. She should not have looked. She knew, even as her feet carried her toward that open door, that looking was the exact wrong side of a line she'd drawn for herself back in a coaching inn 9 months ago. Keep your head down. Keep your name quiet. Keep your eyes on your own work and nothing more. She looked anyway. 2 ledgers stood side by side on the office shelf, bound alike, same brown calf, same year stamped on the spine. That was the first wrong thing. That was what stopped her breath before she'd even opened either cover. One was worn soft at the corners from handling, one was clean. Barely touched. She should not have touched them. Knew she should not touch them. Her hand was already reaching before the thought finished forming, which was, she was coming to understand, simply the shape of her whole character decide after. First, sort out the consequences when they came calling. She opened the clean one first. It was the fair copy. The one that would be shown if anyone ever asked to see it. Rents received, sums neat and orderly. The estate a little poor but perfectly, tidily. Tenants all paid up. Repairs accounted for, itemized, dated. A roof over the east wing she read repaired last autumn, £40. She'd stood under that roof 3 days ago and watched rain come through it in 4 separate places. She opened the worn one. The worn one was the truth. And the truth, laid bare in cramped, patient handwriting across page after page, was uglier than anything she'd let herself imagine, even in her most suspicious hours. Here were the rents as they were truly gathered higher, case after case, than the fair copy ever admitted to. Old widows and small tenant farmers squeezed for an extra shilling here, another there, and the shillings simply vanishing, not appearing anywhere in the fair book at all. Here were repairs charged for that had plainly, provably, never been made, the east wing roof chief among them, £40 collected and not one plank replaced. Here were tradesmen's bills marked paid at one figure in the fair book, settled at a meaningfully lower figure in the true one, the difference disappearing into no name at all, into a gap in the world that Eleanor understood, with a coldness starting at her spine and working outward, could only be one man's pocket. 3 years of it, not a servant pocketing spoons. This was a man robbing a house from the roots, patiently, in good ink, while its master grieved upstairs and could not bear to look down. Eleanor stood in the failing afternoon light with the worn ledger open in her hands and understood, all at once and completely, that Grimshaw had waited for exactly the right house. A house with no mistress. No housekeeper. A master who would sign anything sooner than open his sister's books and be forced to remember in cold arithmetic exactly how much she used to carry alone. He had settled into that grief the way rot settles into a beam. Slowly. Quietly. Until the whole structure was hollow and nobody had thought to knock and listen for the sound of it. She heard the outer door. There was no time to think. Her body moved before her mind caught up the worn book back on the shelf, corner to corner, exactly as it had stood, the clean one beside it, and she was already back across the threshold, slate in hand, counting sheets aloud in a voice pitched to sound entirely, boringly ordinary. Grimshaw came in from the market town with rain, still dark on his shoulders. He was smiling before he'd even sneezed her properly, Miss Ashworth. In my office, in her Grace's storeroom, Mr. Grimshaw. She didn't look up from the slate. Her hand, she was distantly aware, was not entirely steady, and she made it steady through sheer force of will. Her Grace has asked me to inventory the linen. 24 pair of Holland sheets, 11 only whole. A pause. Exactly the right make it. You keep a great many accounts these days. Her Grace keeps me busy. Her Grace is 1 in 80. He came a step closer, soft-footed for a heavy man. His voice dropped into something almost kind which somehow made it worse. A word of counsel, Miss Ashworth. This is a large house, with a great deal of dark in it. A young woman with no friends, no family, for you have none, have you? Does well to be quiet. Eleanor set down her slate. Gray. Unafraid, or at least unwilling, on principle, to let him see anything else. And there it was again, the flicker beneath the smile, half a second, gone as fast as it came. He was afraid of her. He'd come in smiling to frighten her, and it was his own fear that had actually driven him here. Because a clever woman with a slate had been standing far too near an open office door. I keep excellent accounts, Mr. Grimshaw, she said pleasantly. It's the one thing no one has ever asked me to stop. Good evening. She walked past him, out slate under her arm. Her hands did not shake until she reached the stairs. They shook a great deal, once there alone, in the dark, with 3 years of theft sitting behind her eyes, like something she'd swallowed and could not bring back up. She did not go to the Duke. She thought about it 3 days and 3 nights, the way she'd thought about it before, except now the thinking had teeth in it, because this time she wasn't dealing in suspicion. She had seen the book, held it in her own 2 hands. She did not go her, she told herself, entirely sound. To go to him now, with nothing but her word and a memory of a ledger she'd have to admit to trespassing to have read at all, was to hand Grimshaw exactly the weapon he needed. A hysterical companion, overreaching her station, making wild accusations against a respected agent of 20 years' service. He would smile his soft pink smile, and the Duke, grieving, guarded, slow to trust anyone who'd shown him kindness, watch it end in a graveyard, just might believe him instead. Better to hold her tongue a while longer. Better to build something Grimshaw could not smile his way past. She began that very night. In her cold room, single door bolted, not because she thought anyone would truly come for her in the dark, but because a half-built case was worse than no case at all, and she understood, from the very first, that she could afford exactly no mistakes between now and whenever this finally came to a head. She started with what she could gather without trespassing again. The tradesman's own tallies, the butcher's stick, already half hers from the earlier discrepancy, the chandler's book, the corn factor's receipts, gathered under the perfectly honest pretext of settling the kitchen accounts herself, which she was in fact also doing, alongside the other thing she was very much not telling anyone she was doing. She copied every figure fair in her own hand, onto pages kept in the false bottom of her workbox beneath the thimbles and the darning wool, where no maid would think to look and no steward would dare. It was slow work, it was frightening work. She did it every single night for weeks, adding a shilling of proof at a time, because that was the only kind of case she trusted, not a rumor, not a suspicion, but a column of figures that added up or didn't, and columns, unlike people, could not be talked out of the truth. Delia Ashcombe arrived on a bright morning in the 2nd week of June, in a carriage far grander than her circumstances strictly warranted, and Eleanor knew within the first 10 minutes of watching her descend from it that this particular guest was going to be a problem. Not the obvious kind. Not Grimshaw's kind, soft and pink and easily read, a sharper kind. The kind that watches before it speaks and speaks only after it has already decided exactly what damage it means to do. Mrs. Ashcombe was born to it, mind, Whitfield explained, in the particular flat tone he reserved for information he privately disapproved of sharing. Ashcombe by her father, the Duke's own aunt, married in. Sedley by her late husband, God rest. though she prefers her maiden name now, more often than not, given how little her husband left her by way of remembering. He set down the tea things with more force than the china required. She'll be a fortnight, she generally is. Does she come often? More since Miss, a careful pause, every family duty seems to require rather more of her lately than it used to. Eleanor understood, before she'd even been formally introduced, precisely what Cordelia's family duty actually amounted to. They met properly at tea in the small south parlor, the dowager presiding from her chair like a small fierce sun, the whole room orbited whether it wished to or not, and Cordelia turned her attention to Eleanor within 5 minutes with the precise, unhurried focus of a hawk that has already spotted movement in the grass and is simply enjoying the moment before the dive. Ashworth, she said, testing the name like a coin between her teeth. From where one wonders. Nowhere so grand, ma'am. My father was a plain gentleman of the north. Was he's a small? That never once reached the eyes, and left you poor creature, so that you carried other women's linen. She sipped her tea, unhurried, entirely pleased with herself. How wearing to have been born a little above one's fortune. Neither one thing nor the other, neither served nor serving. It must be quite exhausting, always watch for the false step. Then you keep better accounts than I do, ma'am, Eleanor said, meeting the bright hard eyes without blinking. For I own I never learned the trick of watching people, only ever learned to watch the linen. The dowager from the depths of her chair made a sound that in a less dignified woman would have been an outright snort of laughter. Cordelia's smile did not so much as flicker, but something behind it moved, recalculated, filed something away for later use. I watch, Cordelia had said, all sweetness, all threat. It is my one accomplishment, Eleanor believed her entirely. That evening, alone in her room, Eleanor sat with her candle and made herself think it through properly. She thought through a column of figures slowly, without flinching, checking each line against what actually stood behind it, because here was the trouble. Because Cordelia was clever in a way Grimshaw had never once needed to be. Because Grimshaw's danger was a slow, patient theft that could be caught with enough time and enough tally sticks, and Cordelia's danger was simply attention, applied in exactly the right place, at exactly the wrong moment. Until now Eleanor had only ever had to outlast one kind of watcher. Now there were two. And they were not, as far as she could tell, working together, which meant, she told herself, blowing out the candle at last, that she would simply have to outlast them both. She had gotten rather good at outlasting things. It was, if she was honest with herself, close to the only skill she truly possessed. It took Cordelia less than a week to understand something. Grimshaw had never once troubled himself to notice that the companion was not merely competent, she was hiding. Eleanor felt the shift the way you feel weather changing before it arrives, a certain quality to the questions. Offhand, almost bored, dropped into conversation like stones into still water simply to watch how the ripples move. Do you have people in the north still, Miss Ashworth? None living, ma'am. How very alone you must be. A pause delicate as a blade. It does make one wonder what a young keeps so very busy about, with no family to write to and no fortune to manage. A sip tea. Unhurried. You are forever at some ledger or other. I do admire the discipline. Wherever did you learn such a skill? Necessity teaches quickly, ma'am. Does? The bright eyes did not blink. I find it generally teaches people to hide things rather better than it teaches them anything useful. Eleanor said nothing to that. There was no answer that wouldn't tell Cordelia something, and she had already learned enough of this woman in 1 week to know that every scrap she gave away would be filed, catalogued, and eventually spent for maximum effect. She excused herself as soon as manners allowed. She did not sleep well that night. It was Widow Marsh who handed her the second thread, though the old woman had no earthly idea she was handing Eleanor anything at all. The dowager sent a basket of jelly out to the tenant cottages at the edge of the estate, a small kindness she performed regularly, and which Eleanor, more and more, was the one who actually carried out, walking the rutted lane past the home farm, past hedgerows heavy with early summer, to a low cottage with a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired old horse's back. Widow Marsh was 70, her hands swollen with age, her manner entirely without complaint, even gesturings up at that failing roof with the resigned patience of a woman who had long since stopped expecting anyone to fix anything for her. Mr. Grimshaw says the estate can't spare the man just now, she said, folding her hands. And I don't grudge it, Miss the Master's had his own grief to carry, poor soul, and I'll not add to it. I only do wonder, she paused, half to herself, the way old women do when a thought surfaces sideways uninvited, the roof's not been touched. And yet Mr. Grimshaw charged the estate the mending of it 2 years back. I remember, for I asked after it that autumn, and he told me it was already seen to. Eleanor went very still. 2 years ago. Round about the spring Miss Rosalind took ill, or a little after, I don't rightly recall which came first. It was a hard season all round. The old woman shook her head slowly. I don't like to trouble his grace with it. Not with his grief. Eleanor stood in the doorway of that leaking cottage with the jelly basket still in her hand and felt something settle into place she did not, at first, want to look at directly. Not the roof, not just the roof, the timing. She told herself it meant nothing. Coincidence, and nothing more. A steward robbing an estate's blind hardly needed a particular season to do it in, would simply do it whenever the opportunity ran thickest, and grief made for very thick opportunity indeed. She told herself this walking back up the lane, and mostly, by the time she reached the house again, she believed it. Mostly she was ashamed, walking back that day. Properly ashamed, in a way that sat differently than her usual careful worry, differently than anything Grimshaw's or Cordelia had managed to make her feel in all their weeks of quiet threats and soft-footed watching. 'Cause that was it. The whole machine laid bare in one old woman's patient, uncomplaining voice. Grimshaw hadn't needed cleverness, only patience. He'd built his theft on other people's decency, on a grieving man who would not look, on tenants too loyal to complain, on a companion too frightened for her own skin to speak a word of what she knew. Everyone in it was being good. And a house full of good, frightened, grieving people was being quietly gutted, and would go on being gutted, until somebody was finally dangerously willing to be seen. She went home. Washed the jelly basket. That night, by her single candle, she added Widow Marsh's roof to the growing column of figures beneath the thimbles, and found her hand steadier than it had been in weeks. The evenings in the library did not stop. If anything, they deepened, in the particular way that happens between two people who are each, separately, carrying something they haven't yet found the courage to lay down. He asked her once out of nowhere, staring into the fire rather than at her, "Do you ever think of leaving Miss Ashworth?" The question landed harder than she expected. "Sometimes." "Why don't you?" "Because the linen wouldn't fold itself," she said lightly, deflecting. And he almost smiled, that almost she was coming to know so well. The one that lived at the very corner of his mouth and never quite finished the journey to his eyes. "You are a very poor liar. I manage well with me." He turned. Looked at her properly. The way he'd looked at her in the gallery that first evening. Level and searching. And some things in his face had softened since then, in a way that frightened her considerably more than Grimshaw's smile ever had. "I find I can tell now when you're giving me the smaller half of the truth." Eleanor's heart did something complicated and unwise. "Perhaps I only have small truths to give, your grace." "I don't believe that either." She said nothing. He let it go, one of his particular kindnesses. She was learning. He pushed exactly as far as courtesy allowed, and never once further, though she suspected, watching frustration flicker briefly across his face before he mastered it, that the not pushing cost him something. It was on one such evening, 3 weeks into Cordelia's visit, a fortnight had somehow stretched, exactly as Whitfield had grimly predicted it would, that he spoke of the sea for the first time. She had noticed the metal before, never asked. Had in fact, spent considerable effort pretending she'd never seen it at all, because admitting she had meant admitting she'd been in the churchyard that night, watching him break, and that was a door she had no intention of opening for either of their sakes. But he brought it up himself, unprompted, turning a paperweight over in his hands the way he so often turned things over when working up to something difficult. "I was at sea before all this." He gestured, vaguely, at the room, at the house, at the whole considerable weight of a title he'd never asked for. "My father held the dukedom lightly, and lived a long while doing it. I had every expectation of a naval career and none whatsoever of this," a dry, humorless huff. "I was aboard when word came he'd died. Came home to bury him and never went back. Did you mind it coming home?" "I minded losing the only life I'd ever chosen for myself." He set the paperweight down with more care than it strictly required. "The Navy teaches a particular kind of discipline, Miss Ashworth. Everything accounted for, every man's post known, every failure traced back to a decision, and every decision belonging to someone, so that nothing simply happens by accident. You learn to hold yourself responsible for what's under your command. Down to the last rope, the last biscuit." He looked at her, and something in his eyes had gone very far away. "I have not," he said quietly, "held myself to that standard here. Not since April, 2 years past. I have signed what was put in front of me and told myself that was enough, because looking closer meant remembering, and remembering was—" He stopped, started again. "It was easier to stay at sea, even on dry land. Do you understand?" "I think I understand you better than you know, your grace." He looked at her a long moment. "I begin to think you do." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that happens between two people who have each, without quite meaning to, told the other something true, and are both sitting very still afterward, unsure what to do with the space it left behind. Eleanor thought, not for the first time, that she was in considerably more danger from this library than she had ever been from Grimshaw's dark passages. She was right. There was another evening, not long after, when the Dowager herself came looking for them both, moving slower than usual on Whitfield's arm, and found them exactly where she'd plainly expected to find them. Eleanor in the chair across from her grandson, the fire low, a comfortable quiet between them that needed no explaining to anyone with eyes. Petronella said nothing about it directly. She rarely did. Eleanor was learning when a thing pleased her most. She simply settled into the third chair, accepted the small glass of sherry Gabriel poured without being asked, and remarked, apropos of absolutely nothing, that the library had not smelled properly aired in 2 years, and wasn't it remarkable how much better a room breathed once somebody troubled themselves to open a window in it. Grandmother, Gabriel said, with the particular patient exasperation of a man who had spent 30 years failing to win an argument with this specific woman, you are talking about the room. You are not talking about the room at all. I am 1 in 80, Gabriel. I shall talk about whatever I please, in whatever manner pleases me most. And you will sit there and let me, exactly as you have done since you were 4 years old and considerably less handsome than you are now. She sipped her sherry, entirely unbothered. I am merely observing that a house left shut too long grows stale. Whatever room you happen to be discussing, windows want opening. That is the whole of my meaning, and I shall leave the two of you to work out precisely which windows I mean. She rose, gathered her shawl, and departed on Whitfield's arm before either of them could formulate a proper response, leaving Gabriel staring after her with an expression somewhere between exasperation and fond despair, and Eleanor doing her level best not to laugh outright. She has always been like this, Gabriel said once the door had safely closed behind them both. Even when I was a boy, my father used to say she could deliver a scolding and a compliment in the very same breath, so cleverly wound together that a man wouldn't know which half to thank her for and which half to argue with. He shook his head, something fond and exasperated in equal measure crossing his face. Rosalind used to say our grandmother spoke entirely in riddles on purpose, simply to keep the rest of us paying proper attention. She seems to me a woman who has decided quite firmly never to waste a single word she doesn't strictly need, Eleanor said. I find I rather admire the economy of it. You would. The almost smile arrived, warm in the firelight. I begin to think the two of you are considerably more alike than either of you would ever willingly admit. She has been doing that, Gabriel said, since approximately the week you arrived. I confess I am no longer certain whether to be embarrassed on her behalf or entirely grateful. Perhaps both, Your Grace, Eleanor said. I find that's usually the safest and where your grandmother is concerned. Cordelia's second month at Renfield brought her closer, not further, and Eleanor understood too late that this had been the design from the very start. Proximity as a weapon, patience honed slowly enough that its owner could pretend, right up until the moment it was finally used, that she hadn't meant any harm at all. It was in the rose garden on a warm afternoon, heavy with the smell of high summer, that Cordelia finally showed her hand. You have made yourself very necessary here, Miss Ashworth. She cut roses as she spoke, unhurried, each stem chosen with the same calculating precision she brought to everything. My cousin speaks of you, not often, not directly. But I have watched him this month and I have watched you, and I flatter myself I understand men rather better than most. I couldn't say, ma'am. No. I don't suppose you could. A rose went into the basket, thorns and all, drawing a thin bead of blood from her gloved thumb that she did not so much as glance at. I had a letter once, some years past, from a cousin of mine married into the law up in the North Country. He mentioned, in passing, a family ward had run off rather than marry as her father wished. Ashworth was not quite the name he gave, but close. She looked up. Bright. Hard. Entirely without apology. Close enough to make a woman curious, don't you think? A gentleman's orphan, without fortune, who nonetheless keeps accounts like a solicitor's clerk and flinches just slightly, just for a moment whenever a stranger's carriage comes up the drive. Eleanor's pulse was loud in her own ears. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, ma'am. No, Cordelia said, softer now, which was what of how far off worse the sharpness had been. I don't suppose you'd say whatever the truth of it, but hear me plainly, Miss Ashworth, for I shall only say this once. She set down her shears. My cousin the attorney and I correspond regularly on family matters. It would be no great trouble at all for me to mention your name to him again, and ask him to make inquiries through the proper professional channels. Write to other attorneys about wards and trusts all the time. It raises no eyebrows whatsoever, and I suspect it would not take him very long at all to find the right family and the right trustee, and right to inform him where his missing ward has got to. It was, Eleanor understood, with a chill that went all the way to her spine, not quite a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a door held open, quietly, coldly, to show her exactly how easily it could be walked through. Eleanor's mouth had gone dry, but she made herself hold the other woman's gaze regardless. "I understand you, ma'am," she said quietly. "I rather thought you might." Cordelia turned back to her roses, dismissing her with the small, economical gesture of a woman who had said everything she intended to say. "Good day, Miss Ashworth. Do give my regards to the linen." Eleanor could not sleep that night. Lay awake counting ceiling beams by moonlight, running the numbers on how much time she might reasonably have left, and arriving again and again at the same uncomfortable answer. Not much. She rose before dawn, went to her workbox, drew out the false bottom, and looked, by the thin gray light through her window, at the columns of figures she had built, shilling across 2 months of careful, terrified, patient work. It was not enough, not yet. She needed the tenant's own mark against the sums they'd truly paid. She needed more than one man's tally stick set against a posted lie. She needed, above all, a witness who could not be waved away by a smiling steward, or by a clever cornered cousin with an attorney's ear ready and willing at the other end of a letter. She calculated grimly, perhaps a month, perhaps less. She thought that morning of her father, though she rarely let herself do so anymore, because the thinking always came wrapped in a particular kind of ache she preferred to leave undisturbed. He had taught her to keep accounts the way some fathers taught their daughters to embroider, and she had resented it once, as a girl, wanting instead the ordinary lessons other girls received. She understood now, sitting with her false-bottomed workbox open on her knees, exactly what he had actually given her. Not a trade, a weapon. The kind that never needed raising a hand, only raising a column of honest figures against its dishonest one and letting the numbers do what numbers had always reliably done. She closed the workbox, set her jaw, and began to move faster. Sleep, in those became a thing she rationed rather than a thing she simply allowed herself. She would work by candlelight until her eyes burned, then lie awake a further hour turning over what she'd copied, checking it against itself, hunting for any seam in the case that a clever enough man might work his fingers into and pull apart. There were nights she woke at 3 in the morning with a particular figure suddenly wrong in her memory, and had to light the candle again just to confirm it had been right all along, her heart hammering absurdly over a single shilling that had, in the end, been correctly recorded the whole time. She recognized dimly, somewhere in the exhausted small hours of one such night, beginning to frighten herself rather more than Grimshaw or Cordelia ever had. Fear, she was learning, did not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes it built itself quietly, from within, out of nothing more than the accumulated weight of carrying a secret too long without ever setting any part of it down. There was a night not long after, when she nearly lost the whole of it in a single careless hour. She had gone down to the kitchen passage past midnight, candle shielded with one cupped hand, meaning only to check a figure against the corn factor's receipt one final time before she trusted it to her book, and she heard voices, low, careful, coming from the little sitting room just off the servants' hall, where Grimshaw sometimes took his evening brandy, and she should have turned back immediately, should have known better than to linger in a dark passage listening at a half-open door. She did not turn back. "Cannot keep pretending she's only counting linen, Grimshaw." Cordelia's voice, unmistakable, pitched low and hard. "I've seen her near your office 3 times this month alone. If she's building something and brings it to my cousin before I've had the chance to protect my own interests in this house, we shall both of us regret it considerably. She's a companion." Grimshaw's voice, softer, but with an edge beneath it Eleanor hadn't heard before, something closer to real fear than his usual practiced pleasantness. A companion with a fondness for tally sticks. Nothing more. "I've frightened off cleverer women than her, with considerably less effort." "Have you?" A pause. "Cold. Because from where I stand you have frightened off no one at all, still here. Still counting. And I begin to wonder, Grimshaw, whether your confidence is worth quite as much as you'd like me to believe it is." Eleanor did not wait to hear the rest of it. She backed away, slow, silent, every instinct she'd built across 9 careful months screaming at her to move faster, and every ounce of sense she had left insisting she move slower, quieter, or risk the whole edifice coming down around her that very night. She made it back to her room without a single board creaking beneath her. She sat on the edge of her bed a long while afterward, hands pressed flat against her knees, not for her usual 4 minutes but for considerably longer, turning over what she'd just heard. They were not allies then. Not truly, only two frightened people, each protecting a separate lie, each willing to let the other take the fall if it came to that. It was, she thought, both the most dangerous she'd learned all summer, and turned the right way, held up to the right light, possibly the single most useful thing as well. Grimshaw noticed the change in her. Of course he did. A man that patient, that careful, noticed everything, which was precisely why it was quietly dangerous in the first place. He caught her in the North Passage at dusk, a week after the Rose Garden, candle in her own hand, on her way back from a conversation with the corn factor's boy that had admittedly taken her rather closer to the estate office than strict necessity required. Miss Ashworth, a companion, has a great deal of business, Miss Offalat. I was seeing the linen presses fast for the night, Mr. Grimshaw. True as far as it went. He could not gainsay it, and they both knew it, and they both understood a lie sat somewhere just beneath the truth she'd given him, hidden the way everything worth hiding in this house seemed hidden now. He looked at her a long moment. He did not like her being there. She saw that he did not, saw the smile hold in place through sheer effort of will, and understood exactly why. He had built his entire quiet theft on being no one in this house who looked or listened or wrote things down. Companion the tenants had begun bringing their troubles to was exactly such a person. Good evening, Miss Ashworth. Good evening, Mr. Grimshaw. She did not run up the stairs. She made herself walk slow, unhurried, every inch the bored, harmless companion he needed her to be. Her hands were shaking again by the time she reached her room. She resolved, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, that she would finish this soon, before her hands forgot entirely how to be steady. The Duke found her in the still room 2 days later, an errand that had nothing whatsoever to do with him, and she looked up from the shelf of Rosalind's old cordial jars to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. You kept them, he said. Not a question. The jars? Yes, Your Grace. She set one down carefully, the faded label still legible if you knew to look for it. It seemed a small wrong to throw away her handwriting. He crossed the room, picked up the jar she'd just set down, turned it over in his hands, the same careful way he turned over everything he found difficult to hold. For a long moment he said nothing at all, simply stood there with the small glass jar cradled in both hands, as though it might shatter if he held it wrong, and Eleanor found herself holding perfectly still, unwilling to break whatever fragile thing was happening in front of her. I have not been able to come in here, he said quietly. In 2 years I know. You know a great many things about this house, Miss Ashworth, that I have failed to notice myself. He set the jar down, looked at her. I find that troubles me a good deal more than it ought. Why should it trouble you at all? Because I have been asleep in my own home, he said, and you have been the only one awake in it. And I find, watching you, that I should very much like to wake up as well, whatever it costs me. His eyes held hers, steady, unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him. Even if what I find once I do is not comfortable to look at. Eleanor's breath caught. He does not know, she thought, with a small cold lurch, how close that sense comes to the truth. He does not know what he is asking to wake up into. Some things, she said carefully, are better looked at slowly and carefully, and all at once, when a person is finally ready to bear the whole weight of them. Is that counsel, Miss Ashworth? Or a request? Perhaps both, Your Grace. He studied her a long moment. Something passed by eyes. It's not suspicion, but the first faint stirring of a question he had not thought to ask before and was only now beginning to shape. Very well, he said finally. I'll wait for you to tell me when I'm ready. But I warn you, the almost smile finally full Sally arrived, warm and unguarded and entirely undoing her. I am rather less patient than I used to be. The sea taught me discipline, it never once taught me patience. Those I find are different virtues entirely. He left her standing among Rosalind's jars, heart hammering, half in terror and half in something considerably more dangerous than terror, and it took her the better part of an hour to make her hands steady enough to finish her work. She saw the Dowager that same afternoon, and Petronella, who missed nothing, took one look at her face and set down her needlework entirely. You've the look of a girl who's been given a great deal to carry and no idea where to set it down, the old woman said. Sit, I shan't ask what it is. I am 180, girl, and I have learned there are precisely 2 kinds of secrets: those a person needs help with, and those a person needs only to be allowed to keep a while longer. I cannot tell from your face which kind yours is, but I can tell you this much for nothing. She reached out one knotted hand and set it briefly over Eleanor's own. Whatever it is, when you are ready to set it down, this house will still be standing to catch it. It has weathered worse than most people credit. So I suspect, have you? Eleanor said nothing, could not for a moment trust her own voice. But she held the old woman's hand a moment longer than strict manners required. And when she left the south parlor that evening, she found she was crying quietly in the dim of the corridor, for reasons she could not entirely have named even to herself. Relief, perhaps, or the particular ache of being seen kindly by someone who had not asked to see the whole of what she carried, only offered to hold whatever part of it she was willing to hand over. It was, she thought, walking back to her room with her candle, throwing long shadows up the stairwell, the first time in nearly a year that anyone had offered to help her carry anything at all, rather than simply asking what she could carry for them. She did not know yet that she would need every ounce of that small kindness in the weeks still to come. The letter Edmund Thorpe received, 3 weeks later, at a coaching inn some 40 miles north, was not from his attorney friend directly. It had passed as such things do through several first a solicitor's clerk mentioning it in passing to another clerk, a name that rang a distant bell, a family once known and half forgotten, until it finally landed, entirely by the ordinary slow churn of professional gossip, on a desk belonging to a man who happened, by pure and rotten luck, to be exactly the man who had spent 3 years hunting for it. It told him, in essence, that a young woman answering closely to the description of his missing ward had been observed keeping close company with the accounts of a great household some days' journey to the south. That she went by a name near enough to her own to raise a careful man's suspicion, that she appeared to have made herself in a remarkably short time, altogether too necessary to that household to be easily removed. Edmund Thorpe read it twice, then a third time more slowly, turning it over in his soft, well-fed hands the way a man turns over a winning hand of cards he has waited a very long while to be dealt. He called without particular hurry for his traveling coach to be readied. He had after all a ward to collect, and a small fortune, £4,000 of it, that had been sitting rather too long out of his rightful reach. He smiled the whole way to the stables. Back at Renfield, Eleanor knew none of this yet. Knew only that the house felt, in these last days of a long warm summer, like a held breath about to be let go, and that whatever was coming she was running short of time to meet it on her own terms. She stood at her window that night, looking out over the dark shape of the churchyard wall just visible by moonlight, and thought of a man kneeling alone among the headstones, apologizing for a thing he could not undo. I will not let this house be robbed twice, she thought. Not by Grimshaw, and not by my own silence. Whatever comes, she told herself, watching the last candle in the library window finally go dark 2 floors below, I will be the one to tell him, before anyone else gets the chance to tell him for me. The carriage came up the Renfield Drive on a bright morning in late July, and Eleanor knew before she even saw the crest on the door that her borrowed time had run out early. She was in the forecourt, a basket of cut roses on her arm, meant for the hall table, and she heard the wheels on the gravel before she looked up, and looking up cost her everything, because there he was, Edmund Thorpe, stepping down from the carriage in a coat the color of overripe plums, red-faced righteous, exactly as she remembered him from a drawing room that had smelled of boiled mutton and her own trapped future. The basket fell. Roses everywhere across the gravel, petals scattering like something already giving up. There you are. His voice carried across the whole forecourt, delighted, triumphant. A man who had waited a long while for precisely this moment and meant to enjoy every second of it. There you are, you ungrateful, undutiful girl. Do you have any notion what you have cost me in post horses? Get your box, you are going home to be married as your father wished it, and there's an end of the matter. Eleanor did not move. Could not move for one terrible frozen second, while every careful plan she'd built across 3 careful years came apart in her chest like wet paper left out in the rain. And that was, of course, the exact moment the front door opened, and Gabriel Ravensmere came down his own steps into the middle of it. He'd heard the shouting. A strange carriage in his forecourt was still, however distantly, his own business, and he came out expecting some ordinary disturbance, a tradesman's dispute, a lost traveler asking directions, and found instead his grandmother's companion standing white and rigid among a ruin of scattered roses, while a fat stranger in plum-colored velvet bellowed at her as though she belonged to him outright. What? Gabriel said, in a voice Eleanor had heard exactly once before. On a wet forecourt 3 months past, ordering a man to shoot a horse. The meaning of this? It all came out at once. And it came out badly, the way these things always. Thorpe was delighted to find a duke to appeal to, and laid the whole of it out in his own colors, unhurried, relishing every word. This young woman was his ward, his late uncle's daughter. An heiress of £4,000 held these 3 years past in his own honest keeping. She was promised to his son. She had run from her duty like a thief in the night, hidden herself in service under a name near enough to true to fool careless people, and his grace unknowing, blameless, entirely deceived, had been harboring a fortune-hiding, deceitful girl beneath his own roof. And behind him, arriving from the garden path with something unreadable on her handsome face, came Cordelia Ashcombe. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She stood very still at the edge of it all, watching the wreckage unfold, and something in her expression looked, to anyone who cared to notice, considerably closer to dread than to triumph. Every face in the court turned to Eleanor. She looked at Gabriel. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that very first wet evening, as at a bill he had not expected. Closed, withdrawing right in front of her, the shutters coming down behind his eyes one by one. She saw it happen, saw him decide in the space of one terrible breath that she had lied to him. The one person in a year who had looked at him without fear, without calculation, without wanting anything at all from the title before the man, and now, apparently, a woman with a hidden fortune and a hidden name and a hidden reason for spending so many quiet hours near his steward's office. She saw the library door shut behind his eyes, and found, standing among the fallen roses with her whole careful life coming apart in front of every soul at Rensfield Hall, that she was not afraid anymore. Which was strange. She had dreaded this exact moment 3 long years, turned it over at night, built whole elaborate escapes from it in her mind. And here it was finally arrived, and the sky had not fallen after all. There was only the truth left. And the truth, at least, was simple. Every word this gentleman has said is true. Her voice carried, clear, level, across the whole gravel forecourt. I am Eleanor Ashworth. My father left me £4,000 in trust, and named this man his nephew my guardian and trustee. I ran from his house last autumn because he wished me to marry his son, so that my fortune would stay conveniently in his own hands. He has already spent a good deal of it. His account as my trustee will show as much to any honest man who cares to look. She turned from Thorpe to Gabriel, aware of nothing else in the whole world but him. I came here under my own name, which is Ashworth, and told the Dowager Duchess I was an orphan without prospects, which is true, because money you cannot touch until you are 25 is no prospect at all. A breath steady, I concealed the fortune, not to deceive this house, your grace. To survive it. The forecourt was utterly silent now. Not a single voice, not a single boot shifting in the gravel. Even the birds, Eleanor thought distantly, seemed to have paused to listen. She let that settle. Then she went on, because there was no stopping now, no version of this moment where half a truth would ever be enough again. There is a second book in Mr. Grimshaw's office, worn at the corners, sitting beside a clean one that shows the estate as it wishes to be seen. I have spent 2 months building a case around what that worn book truly says, because a rumor without proof is worth nothing at all, and I would not bring you a suspicion, sir, only a certainty. Her voice did not shake. I have the tradesmen's own tallies set against the sums this house has been charged. I have Widow Marsh's roof, paid for twice over and mended not once. I have the roof over your own east wing, £40 settled last autumn, that let the rain onto my own head not a fortnight past. She looked at him. I did not bring it to you sooner because I was afraid of Grimshaw's smile and of my own name coming out alongside the truth. I was wrong to wait that long. I was not wrong to build the case properly first. And you are being robbed, sir, root and branch, by a man standing at this very moment inside your own doorway. The silence that followed had weight to it. Actual physical weight, like a held breath the whole forecourt was sharing. I can prove every word of it, Eleanor said. Now, the sun sets. Somewhere behind her she heard Mrs. Hargrove's sharp intake of breath. Heard Nell's small startled gasp, quickly stifled. The whole household had gathered by now, drawn out by the shouting, standing in a loose ring around the ruin of scattered roses, and not one of them looked away. For one long heartbeat, nobody moved at all. Then Grimshaw laughed, soft pink, pleasant, exactly as he had always been, standing in the doorway where he'd appeared sometime during the shouting, soft-footed as ever. It was the wrong thing to do. He knew it the instant the sound left his own mouth. Eleanor watched the realization land on his face, watched the smile falter for the first time in 3 months of careful, practiced pleasantness. A man does not laugh at a true account. He laughs when he's frightened of one. Gabriel Ravensmere was no longer looking at Eleanor as at a bill he hadn't expected. He was looking at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope thrown from a passing boat. Show me, he said. They did it in the library. It took the whole rest of that day and half the night. And Eleanor would remember every hour of it, for the rest of her life, the way a person remembers the hours immediately after surviving something they had genuinely believed might finish them. She fetched her fair copies first. 2 months of them, the whole quiet patient case built shilling by shilling from doors and tally sticks and old women's honest marks, laid out now across the library table like a map of every wound the house had been quietly bleeding from for 3 long years. Whitfield sent for the tradesmen. They came that evening in their good coats, uneasy in the great house, laying their own books beside Eleanor's copies and swearing, plainly to the figures. The butcher, the chandler, the corn factor, who had never once in his life been paid to mend any roof over any east wing, because nobody had ever come to him with the coin to do it. Jethro brought the tenants himself, Widow Marsh on his arm, her swollen hands trembling slightly. Though whether from Judre the strangeness of standing in a duke's library at her time of life, Eleanor couldn't say. They made their marks again, by candlelight, in front of Gabriel's own eyes, and each mark landed like another stone laid on a scale that had been badly, criminally unbalanced for far too long. When the tenants and tradesmen had gone home, thanked, sent off with a promise of justice Eleanor prayed she wasn't making too soon, Gabriel sent Whitfield to the estate office for the 2 brown ledgers. Grimshaw had spent the entire evening growing smaller and pinker in his chair by the library door, watching his careful 3 construction come apart plank by plank in front of him. He made one last soft attempt. The fair book was the only book, he said. His voice had lost most of its pleasantness now, though he was visibly trying to hold on to the shape of it. The young lady is mistaken. A companion could hardly be expected to understand the running of an estate this size. Gabriel opened the worn ledger on the table beside Eleanor's fair copies, turned the pages, in silence. He understood the whole of it in perhaps 4 minutes, being, as his grandmother had once told Eleanor with characteristic bluntness, not a fool but a grieving man, which was an entirely different thing. He was very quiet when he finished, closed the worn book, set his hand flat on the cover, on his sister's estate, on 3 years he had refused, could not bring himself, to look at properly. She kept these, he said finally, to no one at all. To the empty air where Rosalind used to sit and read him the foolish parts of the newspaper, she kept them fair. I never once opened them again after she died. I could not make myself. He looked up. His face was terrible, and awake in a way Eleanor had never once seen it, not even in the churchyard, not even in the firelit hour when he'd told her about the sea. I let this happen. His voice did not rise. It went the other way entirely, down to the bone. I signed what you put before me, because signing was easier than reading in her hand what she would have caught in a glance. He turned to Grimshaw. You will leave this house tonight. You will stand before the magistrates by noon tomorrow, and every figure this lady has gathered will go with you. A pause, cold as winter stone. If you have a shilling left of what you took from my tenants, you will restore it. If you have not, you will answer for it as the law answers such men. Grimshaw went. There was in the end nothing else left for him to do. At the library door he turned once, all the softness finally gone out of him entirely, and looked at Eleanor with a hatred that had no smile left anywhere in it at all. You should have stayed a companion, he said. You should have counted your sheets, and kept your eyes down, and let a house like this fall the way houses like it always fall. Perhaps, Eleanor, quiet, steady, entirely unmoved. But I never was very good at looking away from something broken. It is, I think, the one fault I do not intend to correct. Good night, Mr. Grimshaw. When he was gone, the library was very quiet. Gabriel stood a long while, with his hand still resting on the worn ledger, as though he could not quite make himself lift it away, as though letting go of it meant letting go of 2 years he could not get back either. Eleanor gathered her fair copies from the table, page by page, the work of 2 careful, frightened months. She did not know what to say to him, and for once in her whole careful life she did not try particularly hard to find the words. It was Gabriel who broke the silence first. You knew, he said. For months. You carried the tenants' baskets, mended my linen, sat with my grandmother, and said nothing to me. A pause that cost him something. Why not, if you knew? You could have come to me weeks ago. Because a grieving man does not want a stranger telling him his sister's house is being robbed, she said. He wants to be trusted with it gently, or not told at all until the telling can bear its own weight. She set the last page square onto the pile in her hands. So I did not bring you a suspicion. I waited until I could bring you something you could not refuse. She let the pause hang a moment. And there was my own reason too, which you heard plainly enough in the forecourt this morning, and which does me no particular credit. A woman who makes herself noticed makes herself found. So I chose to be careful, rather than useful, for longer than I should have. Her chin lifted slightly. I am not proud of that part of it. No, Gabriel said slowly. But you did not choose it in the end you were seen, and instead of running from it, you turned round and used it. He was looking at her like he had never properly looked at her before, which she thought was perhaps close enough to the truth. My sister would have thought a great deal of you, Miss Ashworth. She never had patience for people who let a house rot quietly rather than risk being noticed for saying so. He pissed. Thank you. I don't believe I've said that properly yet tonight. Thank you. 3 words from that spare, shut-up man. They were worth considerably more than 3. Eleanor inclined her head. Did not trust herself to answer just yet. Took up her months of honest figures, and left him alone in the library with his sister's true accounts open at last, a sous table exactly where they should have been open for 2 long years. That left Cordelia. She had sat very still through the whole of the long evening reckoning, in the far corner of the library, watching the entire machine she had helped, however indirectly, however apart, plank by plank in the candlelight. When Grimshaw was finally gone, she rose. Still handsome. Still upright. And there was something in her bearing that Eleanor recognized at once, because she had worn that same bracing tightness herself more than once, walking into rooms she was fairly certain would end badly for her. I imagine you both think me a very great deal worse than Grimshaw, Cordelia said, and her voice, for the first time since Eleanor had known her, had no bright hard edge to it at all. I did not falsify a single rent. I never squeezed a tenant for an extra shilling. But I have known for the better part of 2 years that something in this house did not add up, and I said nothing, because saying something meant losing the only place left in the world that still, however grudgingly, called me family. She looked at Gabriel. I am poor, cousin. Poorer than you have ever once had cause to imagine, and I have watched 100 doors close on me since my husband died, quietly, politely, the way doors close on women whose usefulness has run out. I told myself silence was a small enough sin set against the alternative of being turned out entirely. Her voice caught just slightly, and she mastered it at once. It was not a small sin, I understand that now. I understood it the moment I watched that ledger open on the table tonight, and realized how much of it I could have stopped, if I had only once been brave enough to say something. Gabriel's jaw was tight. Eleanor watched him weigh it, the coldness of the calculation, the fairness of it, the 2 years of silence set against whatever mercy he had left in him after a night like this one. Your Grace? Eleanor's voice, quiet. May I speak? He looked at her, something eased very slightly in his shoulders. He inclined his head. Eleanor turned to Cordelia. You are right that you did nothing to falsify a single figure. And you are right that silence in a house like this is its own kind of theft. But I spent 3 years perfecting the same silence for reasons that felt, at the time, every bit as necessary as yours. She held the other woman's eyes. I do not think you deserve to be thrown into the road for it. I think you deserve a smaller life than the one you have been clinging to out of fear, and a chance to build something honest inside it, instead of something merely convenient. She turned to Gabriel. There is a house standing empty at the edge of the park. Sound. If Mrs. Ashcombe were willing to take up the still room in earnest properly, not as a guest merely passing through, I believe this house would gain a great deal more from her than it ever lost through her silence. Cordelia stared at her and for a long moment said nothing at all. Her composure, that bright, hard, carefully maintained composure. Eleanor had watched her wear like armor since the very first afternoon in the rose garden, visibly cracking at the seam. I threatened you, Cordelia said finally, very quietly, as though the words cost her something considerable to say aloud. In that garden, I stood among my own roses and told you plainly that I could have you found and dragged back to a marriage you'd crossed half a country to escape, and I meant every word of it at the time. I meant it because I was frightened, and because frightened people will very often choose to frighten someone smaller than themselves, rather than face what actually frightens them. Her chin trembled, once, and you are offering me a still room. I am offering you a chance to stop being frightened, Eleanor said. The still room is only where I thought you might begin. Cordelia stared at her. Whatever she had braced herself to meet in that room tonight, it had not been this, and it undid her considerably more thoroughly than judgment would have. Why, she said. It was not a graceful question. It was torn out of her. Because I know exactly how tiring it is to spend years guarding a secret instead of living a life, Eleanor said simply. And because a house that has just rid itself of one thief has no business, on the very same night, turning a frightened woman out into the dark simply because it can. Gabriel looked at his cousin a long moment. Something in his face, still working through the night's whole weight, softened by one careful degree. The house is yours if you want it, he said, on the condition that you never again choose silence over honesty in this family. I find I have had quite enough of both this year to last me the whole rest of my life. Cordelia's composure finally broke, just slightly at the corner of her mouth. I accept the condition, cousin, gladly. She looked once more at Eleanor, said nothing further, but something passed between them that would in time grow into something neither woman would have predicted on a bright afternoon among the roses. Not friendship yet. Not for some months to come. But the beginning of it. Later, much later, when the small house at the edge of the park had become, in its own quiet way, as much a fixture of the estate as the great house itself, Cordelia would tell Eleanor the rest of it, the parts she had not been able to say aloud that first terrible night in the library. That she had married Mr. Sedley at 19, on her own father's urging, because the family portion was already half gambled away, and a good marriage seemed the only door still open to her. That widowhood had come at 30, with a jointure that shrank a little further every quarter, and no children to soften the loneliness of it, and a growing understanding year on year, that the world had very little patience left for a poor woman who had once been rich enough to matter. I told myself Grimshaw's arrangement was a small dishonesty, she said, one autumn afternoon, hands busy with the careful, exacting work of straining cordial through muslin. A little settled here, a little there, nothing that touched the tenants directly, nothing I let myself examine too closely. I told myself I was owed it, in some crooked fashion, for everything else I had lost. She looked up. It was a lie I found convenient. Most lies people tell themselves are, in my experience. That doesn't make them true. You told me that yourself in the library, Eleanor said. Rather more bluntly. I was frightened in the library. Frightened people tell the truth rather more efficiently than comfortable ones. Cordelia's mouth curved, thin but genuine. I find I much prefer being comfortable. I simply had to relearn how to be comfortable without being dishonest about the price of it. You'd be surprised how much patience that takes. I understand a little of that myself. Yes, Cordelia said. I rather think you do. Gabriel Ravensmere looked at his grandmother's companion across the wreckage of his own long blindness. And something in his face that had been shut tight since a spring morning 2 years past came slowly, painfully open. He did not say anything more that night. There was too much to say for any of it to be said in a single evening, and some things needed daylight before a person could properly hold them. Eleanor went up to bed near 2 in the morning, bone-tired in a way that went past her body and settled somewhere deep in her chest, and lay staring at her own dark ceiling, thinking that whatever came next, at least the worst of it was finally over. She slept the deepest sleep she'd had in 2 full months. Edmund Thorpe left Renfield Hall 3 days later, and he left it a considerably smaller man than he'd arrived. Gabriel had sent for his own solicitor from the county town the very morning after the confrontation in the library, and the two of them went over Thorpe's trusteeship accounts with the same patient thoroughness they'd applied to Grimshaw's brown ledgers. It did not take 4 minutes this time. It took the better part of 2 days, and at the end of it, Thorpe's face had traveled from righteous plum red to something closer to gray. His trustee's account would not, in the end, bear an honest man's looking either. There were gaps. Explanations that grew thinner and less convincing with each new question. Roderick's tailor's bills paid it emerged directly from the trust fund meant for Eleanor's eventual dowry. A loan, unpaid and unlikely ever to be repaid, from the trust into Thorpe's own household expenses. You will restore what remains, Gabriel told him, in the same flat, terrible voice he'd used on Grimshaw, or you will explain the shortfall to the Chancery Court, Mr. Thorpe. I find I have developed this week a very particular interest in honest accounts. I imagine court will share it. Thorpe's face went through several colors before settling on something closer to gray. You cannot mean to ruin me over a matter of family business, Your Grace. Surely a gentleman of your standing understands that a guardian's accounts are always somewhat. He searched, visibly, for a word that would not damn him further, somewhat flexible, in the ordinary course of managing a young ward's affairs. I understand a good deal about flexible accounts, Mr. Thorpe, having spent the better part of a fortnight staring at another man's version of the very same thing. Gabriel did not raise his voice. He had learned this summer that he rarely needed to. I find flexibility rather less charming than I once might have. You will restore what you can, and you will sign whatever my solicitor puts before you regarding the remainder, and you will do it before you leave my house today, or I promise you, sir, the Chancery Court will find the matter a good deal less flexible than you're hoping. Roderick, standing miserably by the window throughout the whole exchange, had said nothing at all, had not, in fact, looked at Eleanor once since the confrontation began, which she found, on reflection, rather more telling than anything his father managed to say in his own defense. Whatever scheme this had been, it had plainly never truly been Roderick's to begin with. He was simply a young man who had gone along with what his father wanted, the way sons sometimes did, without ever once asking himself what he actually wanted for his own life. She almost pitied him. Thorpe left in his hired carriage without his ward. Without the marriage he had traveled 200 miles to secure, and without the comfortable certainty that £4,000 of somebody else's money would ever again quietly fund his son's tailor bills. Eleanor watched the carriage go from an upstairs window, felt something in her chest unclench that had been aroused for very nearly a full year. She did not feel triumphant. She felt mostly tired and free, in a way that took her several days to properly recognize, because she had genuinely forgotten what it felt like not to be watching the road for a particular carriage. The house began, in the weeks that followed, to breathe in a way Eleanor had not seen it breathe since her first wet, terrible arrival. The rents came in fair now, recorded in a single honest book kept in Eleanor's own steady hand, with no worn brown twin hidden anywhere in the dark to tell a different story. What Grimshaw had squeezed from the tenants across 3 long years was reckoned up, to the last careful shilling, and given back cottage by cottage, Eleanor herself walking the lane most afternoons to see it properly done, where the man himself could not restore what he'd taken, for there was in the end precious little found on him. Once the magistrates had finished their reckoning, Gabriel restored it from his own pocket, and told her once quietly that it was very cheaply bought indeed. Grimshaw answered first to the county magistrates, then, in the autumn assizes, to a judge who had no particular subsidy for a man who had robbed widows of shillings while their landlord grieved upstairs. His defeat gave Eleanor no pleasure at all, only the sober, settling satisfaction of a thing finally properly set right. She attended none of the proceedings herself. Gabriel offered more than once to have her called as a witness if she wished it, but she found, when she searched her own feelings on the matter, that she had no particular need to watch Grimshaw's downfall play out in a courtroom. The numbers had already spoken for her, plainly and completely, in the one language that had never once failed her. She did not need to watch a judge repeat what her own ledgers had already proven beyond any honest argument. She heard the verdict secondhand from Whitfield, delivered in his usual flat, unhurried tone, and found the news settled into her like the closing of a long-held breath, rather than any sharper feeling at all. Widow Marsh's roof was mended within the fortnight, by the very man who had always, technically, been paid to mend it. Eleanor walked out to see it done herself, on a warm afternoon in early September, and found the old woman standing in her own dooryard, watching the last of the new thatch go up with an expression some between disbelief and quiet, private grief. "I never thought to see it, miss," Widow Marsh said, not taking her eyes off the roof. "Not in my lifetime. You go along, year on year, telling yourself the leaking's not so very bad, telling yourself you'll manage, because there's no earthly use in wanting a thing you've long since decided you'll never have." She wiped one eye with the back of a swollen hand, and then one day a stranger comes walking up the lane with a basket of jelly, and a way of listening that makes a body forget she'd stopped expecting to be listened to at all. "You were never asking for anything more than what was owed you," Eleanor said gently. "I only made certain it arrived." "Well," the old woman's chin trembled, just slightly. "Before she mastered there's owed and there's arrived, and precious few people in this world trouble themselves to see that the two of them meet. You did. I'll not forget it, miss, whatever they end up calling you before all's done." Eleanor walked back up the lane that evening with the empty jelly basket swinging against her skirts, and thought that of all the strange rewards this whole frightening summer had brought her, an old woman's dry-eyed gratitude over a mended roof was, in its quiet way, worth more to her than anything £4,000 could ever purchase outright. It was in the middle of all this quiet, careful repair, the house, the accounts, the long, slow work of trust rebuilt one honest figure at a time, that Eleanor found herself, more evenings than not, back in the library with Gabriel. Some had shifted between them. Sudden. Not dramatically, but steadily, the way a tide comes in. You don't notice the exact moment the water reaches your feet, only that it has somewhere along the way, and there is no particular use pretending otherwise. "You never told me," he said one evening, weeks after Thorpe's departure, "what you meant to do with your 3 years of hiding. If I hadn't come down those steps that morning and found you standing in the wreckage of my grandmother's roses, I meant to keep hiding," Eleanor admitted. "Be very small, very quiet. Let the years pass, take my fortune the day I turned 25, and go somewhere nobody had ever once heard my name. A cottage, perhaps. A garden. No company at all if I could arrange it." "That sounds," Gabriel said slowly, "like a very lonely sort of freedom." "It was the only kind I believed I was allowed." He quiet a moment, turning that over the way he turned over everything difficult. "I have spent 2 years believing very much the same thing," he said finally. "That the only freedom left to me was to be entirely alone with what I had lost." He looked at her, You have rather thoroughly proven me wrong about that, Miss Ashworth. I find I am not at all certain how to properly thank a person for it. You needn't thank me at all. I rather think I must, he said, because the alternative is admitting to myself how very much I would have missed if you had simply kept your head down the way you first intended. And I do not care at all for that thought. There was a particular evening, some weeks into that quiet autumn stretch, when he asked her to walk with him out to the churchyard, and she understood from the way he asked it, that he was offering her something he had never once offered anyone since April 2 years past. They stood together at Rosalind's grave in the last gold light of a September afternoon, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. I used to come here alone, Gabriel said finally. Always alone. I told myself it was easier that way. Grief seemed a private thing, not fit for company. He looked at Eleanor sideways. I find this evening, I was wrong about that too. I find I would rather have you standing here beside me than have the privacy back. She would have liked that you brought someone, I think, Eleanor said. From everything your grandmother has told me of her, she never did care much for a room with only one person properly awake in it. Gabriel almost laughed, a short surprised sound, half grief and half something warmer. No, she never did. He crouched briefly and set his hand flat against the cool stone, the way Eleanor had once watched him do in the dark, alone, apologizing for a thing he could not undo. This time his face, when he rose again, held something closer to peace than to guilt. I think I have finally stopped apologizing to you, he said quietly. To the grave, to the stone, to whatever part of his sister still lived in his memory of her. I think instead, I am only telling you now. She's kept the house breathing again, Rosalind, just as you always did. Eleanor said nothing. There was, she had learned, a particular kind of silence that honored a moment far better than any words could, and she simply stood beside him, her hand finding his, until the last of the light went out of the sky above the churchyard wall. The summer ball had been Rosalind's ball. She had given it every year without fail the one night the great shut rooms were thrown open, the county driven up the honey-colored drive, candlelight filling the long gallery end to end. There had been no ball for 2 years. And now the Dowager Duchess, who missed nothing and forgot nothing, and had apparently been waiting the entire summer for precisely the right moment to say so, announced from the depths of her chair that there would be a ball again this year. The house is breathing again, she told Eleanor, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has watched a long campaign finally come to fruit. A house that is breathing again should be allowed to dance. So Eleanor opened the great rooms. 2 years of Holland covers came off in a single long dusty afternoon. Shutters folded back to let real light flood in for the first time since a spring fever had taken the house's true mistress. She filled the long gallery with early roses cut fresh that very morning, and had 50 beeswax candles set into essences she'd had scrubbed clean of 2 years' accumulated soot herself. She let out one of Rosalind's own gowns for the occasion, with the dowager's blessing and her own maid, to do the fitting soft dove gray, modest, entirely unremarkable, exactly the color a crowded ballroom would ordinarily look straight through. She wanted nothing else. She had not come to Renfield to be looked at. She was looked at anyway. She was standing near the head of the gallery close to midnight, absorbed entirely in making certain the supper went in properly and the candles were trimmed, when Gabriel Ravensmere crossed the whole length of his own crowded ballroom to reach her. He crossed his sister's ballroom, full of every family of consequence in the district, and stopped before his grandmother's brown-haired companion in her borrowed dove-gray gown. He bowed to her properly, the kind of do meant to be seen and remembered by every witness present, and said, loud enough to carry to a dozen listening ears, Miss Ashworth, will you dance? She had not danced in 3 years. Her feet remembered before her head fully caught up. Halfway through the set, in the warm gold light of 50 candles, Gabriel spoke low beneath the music. The county is watching. They are, Your Grace. You have quite ruined my reputation for invisibility. A companion cannot dance with a duke and remain a companion. He turned her, correct as a clock, through the figure. I have thought a great deal these past 3 weeks about what she might become instead. Have you? I have. The almost smile, finally fully arrived. My grandmother recommends the position of Duchess, with a very great deal of force, I might add. She has never once been wrong in my experience. No, Gabriel agreed. It is, I find, her single most trying quality. The music turned them again. He looked down at her, and the shut face was entirely, unguardedly open now, awake, and afraid, and unafraid to show it. I will not offer you a convenient arrangement, Eleanor. You will have £4,000 of your own within 3 years, and every reason left in the world to be free of any man who ever tried to spend it, or to talk you into silence about anything at all. You do not need me. He stopped. in the middle of the set, in front of the entire watching county, which was not done, was never done, and set the whole gallery immediately, delightedly whispering. "That is precisely why I am asking," he said. "Not because this house needs a mistress. It has had one since April in every way that has ever mattered. But because I find I should like, for the whole rest of my life, to be looked at by the one person who was never once afraid of me. Marry me, not because it solves anything. Only because I would rather have you beside me than safe and unremarkable. Somewhere I will never find you again." Eleanor looked up at him, thought of the wet forecourt, the mare. The snaffle bit still warm in her fist. 3 careful years she had meant to spend invisible and untouched. Safe, she thought, is such a very small word to have built a whole life around. "Ask me properly then," she said, and there was warmth in it, and mischief, the kind she had not let herself show freely in a very long time. "Not the county's version. Mine." Something in his face cracked open, gladly. "Eleanor Ashworth. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Not because Renfield requires it, and not because my grandmother has decided it on both our behalfs. Because I cannot imagine another evening in that library without you across the fire from me, and I have stopped wanting to try. Yeses, simply." And felt the whole gallery seem to exhale around her. "Though I warn you, your grace, I intend to keep the kitchen accounts myself for as long as I live. It is, I am told, a fault of mine. I do not currently plan to correct it." Gabriel Ravensmere laughed. Was not a sound the county had heard from him in 2 full years, and it carried the whole bright length of the gallery, past the startled musicians, past his grandmother, who set down her glass by the door and permitted herself, at 180, to look for exactly 1 moment entirely thoroughly satisfied with everything she had ever engineered. The dancing resumed around them, and the county talked of nothing else for the whole of that season and a good deal of the next, and Eleanor found, standing in the circle of Gabriel's arm as the music swelled back to life, that she did not mind the talk in the slightest. Let them talk. Let them wonder how a penniless companion had somehow become the woman a grieving duke crossed his own ballroom for. She had spent 3 careful years terrified of exactly this kind of attention, and now at last, standing in the candlelight with his hand warm around hers, she found she could not think of a single reason left to fear it. Nell caught her eye from across the room, beaming, and mouthed something that looked very much like "I told you so," though Eleanor was fairly certain the girl had told no such thing to anyone, least of all herself. The dowager, still by the door, raised her glass a fraction of an inch in Eleanor's direction, the smallest, driest toast imaginable, and somehow worth more than any speech the whole assembled county could have offered. The morning of the wedding came in soft and clear, the kind of light that seemed, Eleanor thought, standing at her window in the small grey room that had been hers since that first rain-soaked evening, almost too gentle for a day carrying so much weight. Nell helped her dress. Her hands shook twice, fastening the small pearl buttons at Eleanor's back, and when Eleanor turned to ask what truffled her, the girl's eyes were bright with tears she was plainly trying very hard not to shed, blinking rapidly against them as though sheer will alone might hold them back a moment longer. "Only, Miss, your grace, I mean I'll never get it right, will I?" Nell laughed wetly and pressed the back of one hand to her mouth. "Only I put a shilling on the wager myself that first week. On the month. I've felt wretched about it ever since, truth be told, and I never did know how to say so." "Then consider it forgiven," Eleanor said, taking the girl's hands in her own. "I'd have taken the same wager myself, Nell, if I'd been standing where you were standing. I very nearly did, more nights than I'll ever properly admit to." Whitfield walked her down, in the absence of any father living to do it, his spare, upright bearing betraying nothing until they reached the church door, where he paused, just briefly, and said, in a voice not entirely steady, "In 40 years of service, your grace, I have carried a great many trunks up a great many staircases. I don't believe I've ever once been prouder of where one of them ended up." She could not answer him. She simply pressed his arm once and let him lead her in. They were married quietly at Renfield's own small church, where Rosalind lay in the 2nd week of that high golden summer. The Dowager Duchess came in on her grandson's arm and wept exactly once, at exactly one line of the service, and pronounced it afterward the outside limit of what any sensible woman ought to allow herself. Eleanor turned 25 springs later, and £4,000 came into her own hands at last, clear and free and entirely hers to do with as she pleased. She sat with the solicitor's papers a long while before deciding what to do with it, turning the decision over the way she turned over every important thing, slowly, carefully, checking it against what she actually believed rather than what anyone might expect of her. Gabriel had told her, more than once, that the money was entirely her own affair. that he would not so much as offer an opinion unless she asked for one, and she had believed him, because by then she had learned that he meant exactly what he said, always, in every matter that touched her independence. In the end, she gave the whole of it into the estate, for the tenants' cottages, roofs and all, because it was hers to give, and a thing given freely, she had come to learn, was the one kind of wealth nobody could ever take back from you again. Cordelia never did marry again, and never particularly wanted to, and became in time rather well known 3 counties over for her cordials, made in Rosalind's old still room, with Rosalind's old labels kept carefully respectfully in a drawer beside her own. The Dowager Duchess lived 2 years more, long enough to see the house full again, full every summer with a ball she's never once missed, before she died in her own chair in the south parlor on a bright autumn morning, spine straight to the very last. It was the one grief the summer could never quite mend, that Eleanor came to understand is simply the way of houses. The dead do not come back merely because the living have finally learned how to be happy again. But the gray mare grazed sound and easy in the near paddock every summer after, growing old the way well-loved animals do, so slow and content. Rosalind's stillroom labels stayed carefully in their drawer. The ball was given every year without fail. On a warm evening at the close of that first summer, Gabriel Ravensmere came looking for his wife, and found her exactly where he had half known he would, in the library, in the chair by the low fire, the great honest account book open on her knee. She was not reading it. She was only sitting with it. The particular quiet way a person sits with something that has finally, after a long hard road, come right. "You have run the whole house into good order," he said from the doorway. "There is nothing left to save. Whatever will you find to do with yourself now, Duchess?" Eleanor looked up at him across at the low fire level. Gray. Clear. Entirely unafraid, the very same way she had looked at him from the wet gravel. On the first hour of the very first day, when he had told his own butler she would not last a month at Renfield Hall. "There is always something wanting doing in a house size," she said, and the smallest, warmest smile touched her mouth. "I don't expect I shall ever run entirely out of small wrongs to set right." The almost smile arrived fully easily, the way it always did now. "Come and sit down," she said. "You were drowning in the doorway again." He came and sat down beside her, and the candle burned low and steady, and the house breathed quietly around them, both honey-colored, honest and full, a house that had been holding its breath for far too long, and had finally, that summer, been allowed to let it go. She had come to Renfield Hall to disappear entirely. She had, in the end, become the most thoroughly, completely seen woman in the whole county. And she had learned, to her own genuine and lasting surprise, a single thing she had never once guessed at. Back on that 15-shilling road north, with nothing but a trunk and her father's snaffle bit for company, being truly by exactly the right person, was never the danger she had spent her whole careful life so afraid of. Years later, 5 of them, by the time this particular afternoon arrived, with 2 children now underfoot at Renfield, and the grey mare finally gently retired to the softest pasture on the estate, Eleanor stood once more at the edge of the forecourt, watching a farm cart come up the honey-colored drive with a single trunk strapped to its back, and a young woman walking beside it in the rain, because the bridge, it seemed, was still prone to washing out in a hard spring, and likely always would be. She did not go out to meet the cart herself. She sent Whitfield instead, older now, slower, but still upright as a garden hedge, the first face any frightened new arrival at Renfield Hall would see. She watched from the window instead, her youngest daughter balanced on her hip, and felt something settle warmly in her chest at the sight of it. A new companion, hired at the dowager's old writing desk by Eleanor's own hand, walking up that same drive in that same kind of rain, carrying in all likelihood some careful secret of her own. Every house needed one person willing to notice what everyone else had learned to look past. Eleanor had been that person once, entirely by accident, in a life she'd meant to spend disappearing. She rather thought it no bad thing, passing that particular habit along. She called, as her husband came into the room behind her, drawn by the commotion in the yard below. "We have a new arrival." He crossed to the window and looked down at the drenched young woman making her way toward the front steps, trunk and all, and something in his face, older now too, softer at the edges, in ways that suited him considerably better than the shut, careful stillness she'd first met on that wet forecourt 5 years past, creased into the easy, unguarded smile that had once been so rare a thing, and was rare no longer. "Do you suppose," he said, watching the young woman's careful, steady progress across the wet gravel, the trunk, the set of her shoulders, the particular way she'd already begun taking in every corner of the house's facade as though quietly cataloguing what wanted fixing, "she'll last the month?" "I should think," Eleanor said, watching the young woman square her shoulders against the rain and walk on regardless. Not slowing for a moment despite the mud already climbing her hem. That entirely depends on whether anyone in this house has the good sense to actually listen to her, rather than simply waiting to see whether she breaks. She had come to Renfield Hall, once, a debtor of 22, with 15 shillings and a trunk and a name she'd barely trusted herself to answer to, meaning only to disappear entirely into the quiet corners of somebody else's grand house, until 3 careful years had passed and her own life could finally, safely begin. She had in the end become something she had never once let herself imagine wanting. Not invisible, not small, not merely safe seen. Fully, thoroughly, permanently seen by a household that had learned to trust her hand on its accounts, by tenants who had learned to trust her word at their door, by an old woman who had decided, within one sharp half-minute of meeting her, that she was worth the keeping, and by one grieving, careful, drowning man who had crossed his own ballroom in front of the whole watching county, simply to ask her plainly to stay. And she had learned to her own genuine and lasting surprise, a single thing she had never once guessed at, back on that 15-shilling road north with nothing but a trunk and her father's snaffle bit for company. Being seen, truly seen, by exactly the right people, was never the danger she had spent her whole careful life so afraid of. It was, she had come to understand at last, the only safety that had ever been worth the name at all.